Call the meeting to order. Welcome to the September 13th carryover meeting of the Arlington County Planning Commission. Tonight we will hear a single item regarding rezoning for the land on which the county proposes to build a temporary salt containment structure needed to house material to mitigate and treat roads during snow or ice storms. We will follow our normal procedures with a staff report, public testimony, and commission reports, and then proceed to Planning Commission reports and deliberation. This item would be followed by our monthly business meeting. Established in 1956, the Arlington County Planning Commission is a citizen advisory body authorized by the Virginia State Code. Its members are appointed by the Arlington County Board. The Planning Commission promotes the orderly development of Arlington County and its environs by advising the County Board on development, use of land, public facilities, and zoning. Please note that all Planning Commission meetings are audio and videotaped. You can find past meetings on the county's website. Please turn off all cell phones, and if you would keep them away from the microphones, that would be great, as there can be feedback. For public testimony, when you hear your name called, and they will be called two by two, please come to the front of the room in the order your name has been called. Tonight, we will have a full discussion of all the issues that have been kicked up by this item. I want to acknowledge the deep concerns raised by civic association and interested groups in response to the County Board's decision to go ahead with a temporary structure before a full public process was put in place. The county was tardy in raising a concern about the viability of the existing salt dome structure, for which apologies have been publicly made by staff, the county manager, and board members. This tardiness has interrupted the normal steps in our process, with action being taken to build the temporary salt dome prior to a complete planning process. County Board Chair Crystal assures me that the board is aiming to adopt the charge for a task force working group for a comprehensive long-term plan for 26th and Old Dominion at its board meeting on September 22nd, immediately following the rezoning hearing, or if the complete charge has not been thoroughly reviewed by all county board members, then at the latest by the board's carryover meeting on the 25th. It is clear that comprehensive planning should precede action. It is also clear that people and institutions do make mistakes. But that does not mean that we should impede an action that could create unsafe conditions on our roads this winter. As we will hear later, the GLUP is not proposed to be changed now, and the rezoning will be reconsidered, as I understand it, during the larger planning process to come. The county's plan for the temporary site has also been scaled back in response to community concerns, and I hope we will be given further information in that regard tonight. I just would also conclude by saying that county processes and principles are critical in making the government work for everyone, and we rightly embrace them. But they should not be so rigid as to be unresponsive to unforeseen or mistakenly unanticipated challenges to the common good. And we can and should explore better ways of managing competing issues or novel technologies going forward, as I hope we will do in the coming months. So, with that, just in time. Yes, you need to get your speaker slips in before the item is called. I'm assuming everybody's done that, so Madam Clerk. Whoop, there we go. Madam Clerk, will you please call the item?
Thank you. Our item this evening, as described, is the Salt Dome rezoning, 2232 determination for 26th Street North and Old Dominion. The case number is Z-2605-18-1. As I stated, the rezoning, and B is the Virginia Code Section 15.2-2232, determination for aforementioned salt storage facility site. We have Margaret Tulloch. Rose, thank you. And Jennifer Smith to present this item this evening if needed. And I'm sorry, Greg. It's been a long week. I'm sorry. Greg Manuel, I'm so sorry. And George May. Thank you.
In that order, will you be presenting in that order, first CPHD, then DES? Is that how you want to
Actually,
do
the
it?
reverse order. So Greg will
okay.
begin, and then I'll conclude.
So, is it to Mr. Emanuel? Please.
Right. Thank you and good evening. Thank you, Madam Chair. Thank you for an excellent framing of the situation. I frankly could have chosen better words. So I'll have a brief presentation tonight about our North Side salt operations and kind of the background of how we arrived at the request before you this evening to support a rezoning and make a favorable 2232 determination. My briefing tonight is basically a modification of what I briefed the board on back in July with some updates and clarifications. As you know, back in July, the board recommended advertising rezoning of the 4 county-owned parcels, which will be necessary for us to replace the salt tank with an interim structure to provide those continued operations on the north side. And as we talk about this through the evening, inability for county crews to load on the north side of the county will have an immediate adverse impact on winter safety for the public, which is why we need to address this, albeit in a very uncomfortable situation. I am pleased to report that since July, that the acreage for rezoning has been substantially reduced as a result of the final siting of the facility, which was determined after the advertisement. And again, I just want to acknowledge up front that this process and the timing has been far outside the norm of how we normally proceed in this community. It has been difficult at best to put limited options and an urgent timeline in front of the county board at first, the community, certainly, and now the Planning Commission. So it's clearly not how we prefer to do our work, but I think you nicely outlined the situation we're facing. So I'll jump in. So I'll provide some background info and then turn it over to Margaret for a greater depth discussion on the rezoning and the 2232. It's important to frame the fundamental issues surrounding our request this evening. These are kind of our key assumptions. Can you go to the next slide there? You got it? All right, okay, there we go. So here's you got it. These are our key assumptions that drove our recommendations this evening. First, we can no longer safely use the existing salt tank for winter operations. That's just the basic situation. Second, we need to replace the 6,000 tons capacity on site with an interim structure. Thus, this request for the rezoning and the 2232 determination. Here's a quick overview of my portion of the briefing. And again, it roughly parallels what I briefed the board back in July. So for decades, we have operated out of 2 sites to meet our winter mission. They're shown here on the red dots on the north and south side. This split allows for efficient operations and minimal wasted time for our crews or deadheading. The short story is that we can't meet our mission in a timely manner operating out of one site, and our response time, if we tried to operate out of just the one remaining site on the south side, would increase an estimated 30 to 40%. And so what that would mean in a typical 24-hour response time for a small snow now becomes 34 to 40 hours, and then that could in turn affect, are we having school, are we not having school, what's happening economically to the community. So it's a significant impact. Next slide. These graphics attempt to demonstrate the consequences of losing the north side. In this chart, the bars are shown in gray for the north side. More than 60% of our storage capacity exists at the north side, and a similar percentage of loadings occurs there. So this kind of shows the historical loadings on this south side and the north side. Again, the south is in blue, the north is gray. And it shows over the last 5 winters. The red line there shows the south side capacity. So out of one of the last 5 years, we wouldn't quite be able to meet our capacity for the entire winter out of the south side. And so, because we would meet that effectively, if we chose the south side only option, basically would have a 0% chance of success using this data the last 5 years. Now, we do occasionally get resupply, but we've also had problems with resupply historically, depending on what's happening in the region, because the supply chain follows regionally, and it's simply too much risk to take on that type of an operation this winter. Okay, next slide. It's important to highlight some of the history of the tank. It was purpose-built to store water originally, and then somewhere my predecessors did an adaptive reuse back in the 50s, and it's been rusting ever since because that's what salt does to metal. And we've extended its life, though, several times. Most of the damage and the risk on the structure was on the roof. We've done a number of extension. We've added columns, and first there was a center column, and then George did a project a number of years ago. We added additional columns to help hold up the roof. What happened in this most recent analysis was that we realized it wasn't just a matter of holding up the roof. Now the walls were failing as well. And when the walls start to fail, you start to create some unpredictable failure patterns that just did not allow for safe operations anymore inside the tank. So once we got the most recent analysis, we sought every possible way to extend the life, but we were unsuccessful in finding a practical or rational solution. And so then that culminated in a CIP work session, just a matter of timing. It was an opportunity to discuss with the board on the 12th of June this year. We told them we wouldn't be able to use the tank anymore because it was one of those things we were considering for CIP funding at one point. And so that same day, I notified the Old Dominion Civic Association president, who I've been having an ongoing relationship with in discussions about the site. So once we established that the facility was not operationally sound, we undertook several investigations and looked at several options, including a tear down and reconstruct options. We drafted several alternatives, presented to the county manager. He asked all the right questions, and we concluded that the logistical challenges, the various risks of construction, the zoning challenges, an extremely aggressive schedule resulted in a low probability of successful completion and operation this season if we were to try to rebuild and tear down and rebuild on the same site. We had found a structure that could comply with the zoning that would fit on the site from a geometry standpoint, and meet the setbacks, but there was no way we could build it in time because it was a much more elaborate construction process and a lot more concrete and foundation work, and the removal of the existing tank followed by that just made it impossible on timeline. We also looked at, we reached out to VDOT, we looked at other alternative sites surrounding municipalities, and we made both formal inquiries to our neighbors, and pretty much nobody has that excess capacity beyond what they want to need and use for the winter. So that's when we shifted our attention to the 4 residential parcels, which are before you this evening. We also looked at the Buck site briefly, and the leaf storage and operations storage site. That was part of a result of a community engagement. They wanted us to try to flip-flop and put the facility on the leaf operations site and put the leaves over there, seeing if that could work. But that unfortunately doesn't work because the timing is for winter operations is immediately after the leaves. And in fact, the leaves operations typically are still there into January before we get rid of the leaves. So there was too much overlap in the use of the sites, and the timing didn't work out for that either. We also looked at the trade center, but as you know from previous discussions and JFAC discussions, the trade center is already maxed out and doesn't have that flexibility of space for additional operations down there for a temporary structure. That all culminated then in a discussion with the board, which occurred in 2 evenings on the 17th and 18th of July, where we looked at these things, and at that point, the discussion about moving around the potential structure to minimize, on the site, to minimize the use of trees just kind of began. And it was at that time that we got guidance from the board to kind of shift to this tree saver option. We also laid out with the board a schedule that required us, unfortunately, to begin with site work and preparation before your actions this evening, and then the county board's formal actions anticipated later this month. Awkward again, but necessary to meet the public safety timeline, which is our target to have it ready for operations in November. So the next slide shows how the site evolved over time rather quickly. If you look at the dates through July, we started off kind of in the northwest corner right next to Marymount, thinking that that was the least likely site that would result from a permanent structure. In other words, when we do the master planning, I felt that that was the least likely ultimate site. And so I didn't want to site the temporary where we wanted to put the permanent, because I'm creating a new construction crisis for the future. But we made the decision to not go with that thinking and paid more attention to the community and their desires to save trees and to get it closer to the existing operations. And so the structure kind of shifted straight to the southeast down Old Dominion. On July 16th, the middle of the picture, which is right before we briefed the board, we had planned on keeping the interim salt pile, which is just to the north of the tank, and that drove that layout. But after the board briefing and more discussion on trees, we evolved it even further, and we said, okay, we'll take the risk, we'll haul off the temporary salt pile, and we can live with that risk if we think we can meet our timeline, and so we'll lose the temporary salt pile. And that's really hard for a guy who has salt on hand for the winter to send salt away. But we did that, and that went to the next slide. It continued to evolve, and then we got into really, once we had the general placement, we got into really detailed discussions about trees, working with the arborist, and we significantly pared down the amount of trees that were affected. We met with the community on August 7th and got their buy-in to the concept that even if the arborist thinks this tree will die by our operations, if we don't have to take it down, let's take the chance, prune the roots, and see if it lives. So that's kind of the contract we made with the community, that we're going to see what we can do to keep as many of these trees alive as possible. So if you look on the left side versus the right side, the number of red trees that were planned to be removed decreased. The ones that may survive increased. The ones that are definitely going to keep stayed about the same, that we knew were going to be a high chance of survival. But it's all about trying to preserve as many mature trees as we could. Unfortunately, there's a couple ones, including a 24-inch live oak that kind of sits right on the north portion of the site that had to be removed, and that tree was removed last week. Okay, so next slide here. Just throughout this rapid evolution of the design, because it's happening pretty fast, day by day, week to week, we engaged on site with the community, and we also engaged them on the selection of the canvas color, because that was one thing that they could input on. And you can see in the upper right side there, the top choice was hands down a kind of a forest green color amongst the choices the three choices that were available from the vendor. At that point, we had already placed the basic order into the vendor, but we could still select the canvas color. So, again, following the schedule that we had briefed to the board and getting underway so that we increase our chances of being successful at meeting our November date, we got underway with construction, the first phase being site clearing last week after we had awarded the contracts to a job order contractor. So last week we saw the removal of vegetation and trees, and this week we're praying for no more rain. I mean, I feel awkward saying that, knowing what our countrymen are facing in North Carolina tonight. Of course, it pales by comparison. But we certainly want to get underway. The next phase in the site clearing is for them to remove the dirt down to a certain depth and start bringing in the rock and compacting it and laying basically the foundation for the flexible asphalt that will go on top and form the foundation for the structure. So, mercifully, the hurricane is turning away from us for many reasons, to include this site, which we need to get out there. And it's a little too soggy to work right now, which is why you see the equipment if you drive by, and no action like today, is my understanding. Again, I wanted to highlight a little bit, next slide, highlight a little, the trees are a big thing for obviously good reasons. And, seeing them in plan view is, you don't get to fly that bird view too often. So we try to present here kind of before and after pictures from a couple of views of what it really looks like from the street, which is how most people experience the site driving by. I should have resequenced these, but we just added these today. I'll take you to the bottom slide first. The bottom slide is at the corner of 26th and Old Dominion looking southeast. And it's the before and after from our site clearing. And you can see, you got to look kind of closely. It's one of those, what's the difference between the two pictures? So we added a little yellow arrow there to show you the one big tree that was removed, viewing from that. The upper pictures kind of show a little bit farther down the street, and then just driving by and looking toward the salt tank, which is in the background on the right side, just near that pole. And the street trees aren't changing. That was a big part of our layout and our decision and our approach from the very beginning. And some of you may have been involved, remember the Marymount project across the street. The street trees were planted, it was purely on our own initiative. We had a little bit of money, there was some contribution from the Marymount project. And on our own initiative, not knowing when the master plan was going to begin, not knowing when we were going to get money in the CIP, not knowing where and when Fire Station 8 was going to happen, we simply started doing some perimeter plantings. And so I'm pleased to report that that was successful. They're growing very well. And ultimately, after we master plan the site, we may need to remove one of these or two of these or whatever, depending on what we want to lay out and where. But I think it's a reasonable thing to do that we chose to do, and it was within the money, to get trees growing, because we're blessed here that they grow so well and so quickly. And why not when you're in a state of uncertainty? So that's just a little historical thing that we did, and I think it's helping us now.
And they'll certainly be well watered.
They are very well watered. Okay, so this next slide is a updated view of what we showed the board back in July. It reflects our actual progress, some of the key milestones. It reflects the reality of what we awarded of the contract performance, which is 7 weeks, assuming it doesn't rain, and then negotiable when it does. So there's really no float or flex in the schedule to get to November. It shows the overlapping activities of the delivery of the canvas structure and the erection of that structure, which is a separate contract from the site clearing and grading and the installation of the asphalt. There will be a block foundation that has to go into. There's some time allowed in the schedule for that. And then we have to transfer the salt over carefully, remove it from the tank, and then haul it over to the canvas structure. So those are all kind of a simplified milestone. Next slide. And then, finally, we have some input on how to do the master planning. A working group now is, back when we briefed the board back in July, that time we told the board, let George build this, and then we'll start the planning process in January. We'll do it within 3 quarters. But the thinking has changed since then. Discussions with the board, I think they're starting to home in on a person who's going to lead the group. So for many reasons now, it sounds like we're shifting to an earlier date for a start of that actual planning process, which we believe will be welcome in the community. It makes our job a little bit tougher to keep both going at the same time, getting a really hard deadline toward winter and still kicking off the master planning process. So we're ramping up our efforts to lay out the scope of work so that we can acquire the professional services to help us with the master planning process. So we're working hard with the board right now. Next week, you'll see the board's actions and likely adoption of a master planning charge for the site. So I hope you find these things useful, and I now turn it over to Margaret for the additional details on the rezoning and GLUP and 2232.
Thank you very much.
Thank you.
Thank you. In order to be ready for winter storm events, staff is proposing a rezoning. The current salt storage facility is a non-conforming use on the S3A parcel. If this facility could be rebuilt with the same or less capacity while meeting zoning standards, including height and setbacks, its non-conforming status could be continued. However, timing precludes this option. Relocating the salt, dismantling the current facility, and building a new facility in the same footprint cannot be completed by November in time for winter weather. As a result, staff examined other zoning districts that would allow for salt storage. Staff ultimately determined that PS is the most appropriate zoning for this area and advertised a rezoning of all 4 parcels along Old Dominion Drive to PS. However, in response to community input regarding tree and open space preservation, staff shifted the location of the proposed facility closer to that of the current facility, and now only a portion of the westernmost lot is proposed for rezoning to PS. PS allows for various uses, including salt storage and associated operations, as well as parks. And the reduction in the rezoning is really about 89,000 to 66,000 square feet. In terms of the general land use plan, which establishes the land use vision for the county, the extended 26th and Old Dominion site is a mix of public and low residential land, with crosshatch symbolizing public ownership. Staff carefully evaluated the land use in this area, but at this time does not recommend any amendments to the general land use plan. Typically, staff undertakes a planning process to evaluate the land use prior to proposing any general land use plan amendments, and this is the process staff recommends for this site. Staff does not want to presume to set a vision for this area prior to receiving community input. Therefore, at this time, staff is only proposing a rezoning to enable development of this interim facility. And for additional background, PS is typically associated with government and community facilities as a GLUP category. However, the general land use plan and zoning designations for the full county-owned area will be analyzed during the upcoming master planning process. As for the 2232 determination, Virginia Code requires that the Planning Commission make a finding that the proposed facility is consistent with the comprehensive plan. A salt storage facility already exists at the 26th and Old Dominion site, and the proposed interim facility will not substantially change the location, character, or extent of operations. This area is already shown with crosshatch on the general land use plan, which denotes public ownership. Staff is also undertaking a general land use plan reprint process, which is looking at how we will show features going forward. The proposed rezoning to PS will serve to reinforce the public facility as a feature shown. Staff recommends that the Planning Commission find that the interim facility is a feature shown on and is substantially in accord with the comprehensive plan. In summary, the staff recommends that the Planning Commission recommend approval of the attached ordinance to rezone the subject site from R6 and S3A to PS Public Service District. Staff also recommends that the Planning Commission find that the location, character, and extent of the interim salt storage facility are substantially in accord with the county's comprehensive plan per the requirements of the Virginia Code. In terms of next steps, the county board is taking up this item at its September 22nd meeting, and staff will begin initiating the master planning process for the extended site as directed by the county board. This concludes staff's presentation. Thank you.
Thank you very much. Ms. Tulloch Rhodes, that's the full name, right? Very good. Thank you so much. I think we'll turn now to public speakers. Madam Clerk, how many public speakers do we have?
We have 6 speakers tonight.
6?
7.
Very good. Thank you. Please call the public speakers.
Our first 2 speakers are Michael Hogan and Richard Lolick.
Richard's not here.
Okay. Mr. Hogan?
Thank you, guys.
Mr. Hogan.
I'm Mike Hogan. I'm the president of the Old Dominion Citizens Association, which is immediately adjacent and host the current salt storage facility. Want to thank you all for your service on the Planning Commission. I know it's you have a lot on your plates lately, and it's not been always easy. And I guess I should apologize for the strident letter that was sent by the civic associations that neighbor this site, the Marymount University, 2 of the churches, and another neighborhood group. We recognize that the county needs to provide the services. They're providing these services to us, the citizens, and we appreciate that. And sometimes trade-offs need to be made to accommodate emergencies and to enable the uninterrupted provision of these services. So, you know, we certainly understand that. And we seek to be helpful civic partners in the debate and in the dialogue and the decision-making about land use in our neighborhoods. And we think that part of that responsibility for civic engagement includes calling fouls. If you have to take extraordinary steps and go outside all planning processes and normal procedures, it should be hard. And I guess that's our role tonight. You have to make a decision based on 2232 in the Virginia Code that basically says you have to certify that this proposal is compliant with the comprehensive plan. The letter that we sent basically outlines, and I will not read it for you, but I will make a top 10 list out of it. The proposal is not compliant with the comprehensive plan, and any neutral reading of that, of the pieces of the plan will show the many ways it's not compliant. Foul number 1, there's been 0 planning of this site. Even though our Citizens Association suggested in the 2015-16 CIP that we do planning, and we suggested and submitted plans to the county for the whole site. Those were ignored, and here we find ourselves today. Foul number 2, 0 public discussion, none whatsoever. This is it. You guys are the whole ball game here. Number 3, it's counter to the comprehensive plan goals. Number 1 and 2, it's counter to the GLUP goals. Foul number 5, it's not in compliance with the planning policies and procedures. Foul number 6, it's non-compliant with the public spaces master plan, the urban forest master plan, the natural resources master plan, the stormwater master plan. Basically, never have so many planning rules been violated in one proposal as this. So, you know, we think that land use decisions are important and often can be forever. We recognize that this is intended to be temporary. We don't know what temporary means. We'd like some commitment on what temporary means, and perhaps that's not your role here. Perhaps it is. If I'm wrong, let me know. But, you know, when the good people at DES approached us in June and said, we'd like to tear this down and rebuild it on the current site, we said, great, how can we help? They thought that they could do that in 5 months. 2 weeks later, they changed their mind and said, we've got to rezone all this land out to the corner, and we appreciate the reductions in size and scope of rezoning and the repositioning that they've done. They've been good partners in the limited time and discussions we've been able to have. But, you know, I think that we appreciate the changes. We're very concerned about how long the temporary facility will be there. It's 47 feet tall. It's taller than the spire on the Church of St. Mary's and the cross atop Marymount's dormitories. It will be the defining feature of the entrance to our neighborhood, and it will say, welcome to Industrialville. So we're calling fouls. We're saying this is not compliant with the comprehensive plan. We recognize that this is likely to go forward. We think that other sites should have been considered. The Buck site has 3 locations that will house this structure adjacent to I-66 and easy to distribute salt from, safer, and will allow staging off-road. So that's the spiel. Thank you for listening. We do appreciate your service, and have a good night.
Thank you.
Next speaker is Mary Glass, followed by Robert McKeegan.
Thank you. I too would like to thank you for your service. I know how many hours you've put in, not only this week, but many, many weeks, dealing with these really difficult issues. They aren't obvious, and there's no easy answer. So appreciate your time and listening to us. I am part of the Arlington Tree Action Group, which is a citizens movement that is working on preserving and growing the urban forest in Arlington. And this came to our attention because of the removal of some trees in lands that are currently being used as parklands. But as we got into it, we became much more interested in some of the other issues that it raises. In this case, it's the request for rezoning and the 2232. We think that these violate the spirit of the GLUP and all the supporting documents, as Mike was talking about. We think that you're being asked to ignore years of comprehensive planning in order to fix a situation that was created by county staff, for which alternatives do exist. Those alternatives have been given to the board and to staff, and we've received no response. If this request is approved, it is something that is a huge difference from what normally is done. If a developer or a citizen came in with this kind of request saying, gee, we didn't plan ahead, but we want a huge exception from all the general use plans and zoning and everything so that we can fix it, that's not a very good idea. And I think they've led us down a bad road to get to this problem, and they're leading us down another bad road trying to solve it quickly. And this is being done with the promise of future planning, and that, frankly, has not happened, despite many promises over 25 years that they would do something with this particular plot and plan for it. The temporary structure they're talking about is not temporary. The estimates that I've been given are a minimum of 3 to 5 years. And in fact, if this rezoning goes through, they can have it there basically forever, because they'll have the kind of zoning that allows them to do whatever they want with that site. Because there were no public hearings, none of these things came up. There were tours and presentations by staff, but no ability to counter. And when I sent in a very specific proposal, a detailed proposal for using the Buck site, it was never responded to. And when the Buck site, which they have dropped from their current presentation, was presented to the board in July, they did not pursue that site, even though it had some very good ratings. And so I believe that the public trust in the public process has really been violated. One of the most recent ones is that they've gone ahead and cleared the site without having the approval for this new use on the site. They've taken down the trees, which are irreplaceable. We don't even get a chance to wait for the board to make a decision on it. There were no public notices to the community, other than some very limited contacts with the civic associations, so that the people living around there knew what was going on. It was only through some postings that I put on neighborhood sites that got people really interested in this. Even this hearing, there was no public notice posted at the site that there would be a hearing on this tonight. And I think that's all very short-sighted. I'd like to read something from Peter Fallon, who was the president of the Donaldson Run Civic Association many years ago. He also served on the County Planning Commission from 2004 to 2013. He admits that these discussions can be difficult, but the biggest long-term impact is the proposed zoning. The mulch pile, the salt dome, and the parkland is zoned S3A, and it requires board to approve permit use for most activities. And if the facility is not temporary and is replaced according to the previous planning, public hearings are supposed to be held on that. And as the staff reports, instead they want the PS Public Service District designation. And as the staff notes, this permits the county to do, by right, almost any activity that they want to do. And they don't even have to get board approval for that. They can simply, with this zoning, go forward with whatever they want to do, which is kind of scary given what's happened so far. And he notes that he, too, was involved 25 years ago in the planning and requesting a master plan and is still waiting for it. He believes that this should be zoned, the entire area should be zoned S3A and not the PS. Thank you for your time.
Robert McKeekin is followed by Collier Cook. Okay. Collier?
Good evening, Commissioners. I'm Collier Cook, the president of the Ballston Virginia Square Civic Association. I'm here tonight as someone mentioned to me just a few days ago that some fellow Arlingtonians are proposing to place the subject salt dome at the Buck site, which is within our neighborhood. We, as a neighborhood, have not been engaged by either county staff or the advocates of the move to the Buck site. So there is no association position on the matter before you, but I would like to make a few personal statements to the different parties involved. First, to the neighbors that propose moving the operations to the Buck property. I understand the less than ideal situation that is before us and the impacts it may bring. But if solutions to your problems are outside of your neighborhood, please have the courtesy of reaching out to those impacted neighborhoods. I promise we won't bite. Second, to DES staff. I appreciate as a taxpayer the adaptive reuse of an old water tank for salt storage and the repairs over the years to keep this structure usable. But as was stated in yesterday's Post article, and I'm paraphrasing here, rush should not be an emergency. So I ask, does the county have an enterprise asset management policy? Does DES maintain and execute a comprehensive enterprise asset management plan? I ask because these types of systems help you choose well in advance the decision to either repair an asset or replace it. I work for the Airports Authority, and we have recently adopted such a policy. And it's already seen some positive results for us. It's helped us identify and plan capital projects and identify maintenance needs in order to keep our facilities in a good state of repair. And finally, to you, Commissioners, I will now share with you my worry that I previously expressed to the County Board during the CIP process. The Buck site will continue to be the panacea to all county issues that require public land. We have already seen APS float some questionable proposals, and we expect more to come. I'm also wary of any new temporary facilities constructed at the Buck site. As I mentioned before, I work for the Airports Authority. And just an aside, back in 1985 out at Dulles, we built a couple of passenger concourses. And with the expectation within just a few years later, we'd replace them with a permanent concourse. Now, 33 years later, those concourses are still in active service today for United Airlines, and construction work has just commenced to extend their lives for another 10 years. So anything temporary can become permanent. Inertia can be very hard to overcome. So I urge you to push back on proposals, not just this one, but others that will come before you until a master plan for the Buck site is complete. Having said that, using the existing facilities that are already there can and should be considered in the interim. I appreciate your time. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much.
Bill Richardson is followed by Jacqueline Wilson.
Good evening. I'm the president of the Donaldson Run Civic Association, one of Peter Fallon's successors. And I can echo what Mike, I think it was, or Mary said about our civic association, which is another adjoining civic association to this site, that for many, many years, we have been eager to get a master plan in place and to participate in the process of providing input for what the site should have. We have been repeatedly told that it's not time yet. Last year, when the Joint Facilities Advisory Committee was formed, or 2 years ago, this was identified as one of the sites that they were going to look at. Last year, we invited them to our civic association to understand more about the process for that, and we're told, go away, it's premature. We too, like the folks in the Buckside area, are eagerly awaiting a master plan, and unfortunately, what we have here is a situation where you've been put in a box, and there's not much you can do about it. But I do want to make a couple of points. One is about the trees. There is the old expression: do we ask for permission today, or do we seek forgiveness later? I don't think you're even being asked for forgiveness for the trees that have been chopped down. You just did it. So it seems to moot a lot of our concerns about temporarily paving over the site without adequate consideration of alternatives, because it's gone. It's done. The trees are gone. Now, we appreciate the staff's efforts to reduce the impact, but as they said, a very large willow oak is gone. Others are compromised, according to the urban forester, and we do agree that we'd rather have compromised trees than chopped down trees, but they're not long for this world, as we understand it. Again, that is not, particularly in light of what's gone before in terms of where you are in the box you're in, it seems to be adding insult to injury. Nothing you can do about it, but I did want to make that point. The second point, I think I heard staff say that with respect to what's before you in terms of recommending something to the county board, that this rezoning to a PS would be, and I may not have understood or caught the words, although PS can be used for various uses, the recommendation would be limited to use for this particular temporary project and subject to the upcoming master plan process. I think it would be important for your recommendation, if you move forward and recommend that this be approved as a rezoning, that you include that kind of condition with the county board. I think that would be one thing that would be very helpful, because one of the concerns that our folks have and other neighborhoods have about the rezoning is the potential misuse of the rezoning for other purposes that might trump or bypass the master planning process. These may be wholly unfounded fears, but I think it's be useful for you to consider that as a condition to your action. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much.
Jacqueline Wilson is followed by Andrew Smith.
Thank you. Good evening. I'd like to echo the thanks for your service. I serve as the Old Dominion Civic Association representative to the Neighborhood Conservation Advisory Commission. Relatively new in that post. I've been in it just over a year. And when I took over from someone who had it for almost 2 decades, she conveyed to me several boxes of the 2002 Neighborhood Conservation Plan. And just to reassure you that the neighborhood has always envisioned that the salt storage facility would remain in our neighborhood, as would the mulch pile. So this is not about trying to not host this site. But my point there is that we've all known for a long time that this facility was failing. This really is a predictable crisis. And so the analogy that I was thinking of is that you have a child, the child turns 2, and then all of a sudden when they turn 18, you're surprised that they're graduating from high school. So this was actually predictable, that we would be in this situation, and it really indicates a shortfall in terms of planning, and I don't know on whose responsibility that is, but it is disappointing as a citizen to see this happening. My second point is that I'm not convinced that there are not other alternatives that exist, that this cannot be accomplished without rezoning. I'm not convinced. I've seen no evidence of that. I agree with the former speaker about the Buck property, and that, you know, perhaps those who recommended that as a potential option could have spoken to them, but there could be other options around Arlington. We don't know because nobody has explored it. The other day I was driving around near where Columbia Pike off of Fort Myer, and there's a big storage facility there with trucks, and I don't know what's different about that. Maybe it doesn't store salt, but there are paved surfaces that exist in Arlington County. But we don't know because we're being put on this pressure to say we have to make a decision. We have to do this before the winter. We have no other options, and personally, I don't see that. My third point is about the responsibilities of government, and you as citizen representatives that will advise and make decisions. I don't take that responsibility lightly in any way. But I've done a lot of international work around the world, working with developing democracies, and these kinds of decision-making processes are rare. So we're honored to have them, and I think it's important that we use them. There are plans in place, as Mike Hogan pointed out, and as you saw in the letter, and this is inconsistent with those numerous plans. And the impact of not honoring those plans could last a lot longer than a temporary salt facility because it impacts people's trust in government. Your responsibilities and all of our responsibilities for fiscal prudence, we've seen in some of the evidence that was presented to you that this is not the most fiscally prudent option. Rezoning, as we've said, may or may not be permanent. We have no reassurances that it would not be permanent, that it would ever change back to something where where the uses that are projected for this area would actually maintain or be honored. And then finally, the environmental impacts. To my understanding, there has not been a thorough assessment of the impacts on Donaldson Run, of the impacts on the green space in the area. I've been reassured that tarmac can be removed, but you know, in terms of potential damage around the salt property that exists now, we don't know. And so I think at the end of the day, it's about Arlingtonians and our ability to trust our government, because right now, all we have are promises that this rezoning is temporary, that the salt dome will be temporary, that plans are in place, and we expect that those plans will be honored. So I think at the end of the day, a loss of public trust may be the worst impact of this decision. So, thank you.
Thank you very much.
Andrew Smith is our last speaker.
Members of the Planning Commission, I live on Rock Spring Road on the other side from where the salt dome's going to be. I'm coming at this from a much different angle than some of the previous speakers tonight. What I'd implore the county to do is treat this project, it's needed, it's necessary, as a different project, as a community asset, not as a standard county building of split-face block, belt courses of brick, and a standing seam roof. If it's a community asset, I think some of the goals and objectives of the surrounding citizen groups can be met, and it can turn into a win-win. there's, through the planning process, I understand this is for the temporary, but in the planning process itself, if the county put restrictions on itself, such as they do with private sector developers, conditions to do and achieve certain goals, I think then it becomes a community asset. If it becomes a typical county building of split-face block, brick, and standing seam roofs, it doesn't belong in this neighborhood. That's really all I have to say.
Thank you. Thank you very much. Yes, of course. We have, I believe, Parks and Rec Commissioner William Ross. Just let me know there are no, do come forward. I think there are no other commissions here. So, thank you, Mr. Ross.
Thank you very much. I just wanted to offer some of the views of the Park and Rec Commission. We've still been talking about the issues that we've looked at over the summertime, and we wanted to offer some longer-term views of the plans, but do have a few thoughts on the immediate proposal we're talking about. Mr. Hogan provided a good reminder, I think, of that we all need to pay attention to our current stated policies when we're doing anything. And the current plans for the temporary replacement do imply some outcomes that are contrary to our general land use plan, the current public spaces master plan, urban forestry plan, and the natural resources management plan. In various places, as I'm sure you all know of the documents, they are called for protection, preservation, and enhancement of trees, impervious surfaces, and other elements of our natural spaces. The proposed temporary replacement plan will clearly impact some of those elements. So I think it's just something that we need to always keep in mind whenever staff's going through something and proposing something, just to always get this perspective and remind us where we do have some inconsistencies and where the trade-offs are. A couple of our PRC members have actually suggested that the buck option be looked at or explored. Now, of course, we haven't had a lot of discussions on this, but I think this would imply a careful review of the recommendations of the Joint Facilities Advisory Commission and what they came up with and what the county board approved after that. And also looking at the county's actions subsequent to that that have already, as I understand, kind of heading down the road. Now, and I'm not sure about the timing of such a proposal under the current situation, but it's just a reminder for the future. We should always look for more robust public discussion that allows staff and the board to review, to show that they are committed to minimizing negative environmental impacts of any kind of county projects. We did have some members also expressing discussion that we've heard from the community on sudden changes in zoning. And I think it's just the impression of some of the Park and Rec Commission members that we sure do a lot of changes in zoning in this county as opposed to using zoning and planning to determine what we can build and site. We do share with the neighborhood concerns about the losses of trees and of the current plan, and do appreciate some of the newer efforts to save some of the trees and to work with the community on that. And we do support the discussion to use any of the destroyed trees as snags. The idea that these could be supportive of wildlife. Now that would be, of course, if it's possible and works into the building. In any case, we'd like to also look at ultimate replacement of trees and other vegetation and providing additional buffering for the neighborhood. And I think that will be crucial down the road, help create a more pleasing part of this part of Arlington County. And for the long term, we'd like to think that perhaps we can get a lot accomplished in this site in terms of long-term planning if we can look at some possible land acquisition at this site or near the site. Of course, if opportunities arise. And then finally, the Park and Rec Commission looks forward to participating in a robust planning and design process for this site that could maximize the natural open space while accommodating as necessary the other crucial county needs that we have. And we are aware of and have supported past neighborhood proposals for a park at this site. Such a park would provide an extension of connected county park land all the way from Potomac to Glebe Road. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much. All right, I think that concludes public speakers and commissions. So the matter is now with the commission, and I'll turn to Commissioner Iacomini for an LRPC report.
Thank you, Madam Chairman. As the commission knows, the timing that is being done with this process precluded having an LRPC meeting on the topic. As LRPC chairman, I was engaged by staff on at least 2 occasions, and we had discussions that were very much like the ones that you've heard this evening in the staff presentation from both DES and CPHD. As they've said, the existing tank is quite old and was originally used for water storage in the 1920s, then converted in the 50s to salt. So it has always been in that site. The county has pursued acquiring parcels to add to that site, and now, as we know, have the whole corner. I think there's 1 out parcel owned still in private hands on that particular block, and staff can correct me but my understanding is that all of those parcels have been acquired with general fund money, not bond money of any particular sort, not facilities bonds, not open space bonds, just general funds. Or am I incorrect?
I'd have to go back and check that, but I believe, George, if you have the knowledge of whether or not we actually use bond money, because over the history of the CIPs, generally, we've had 2 buckets of land acquisition. One was in like the general community facilities, and some of those things are bond. So at various points, we have used bond monies to buy land. And then there's parks, typically bond, which is also used for parks bond land acquisition. That's how it's typically been, although there was 1 CIP where we combined them. So we have to go back and check the source of whether we used any bond money or some combination of, like you say, general fund money and the bond money. But if we used bond money, it would have been in the general fund category regardless.
It would be good to have that clarified. And Ms. Rhodes?
We have talked to real estate staff, and no park bond funds have been used. Correct. It's all been general funds.
Correct.
So
it's just a question of when any was bonded. It may have been some of it bonded. But
you just might want to refine that for the board meeting. But I think what I wanted to establish is it was not park bond money. Okay. So as we've heard, our limitations of being able to reconstruct the tank, mostly time constraints in S3A. You know, interestingly enough, and I think I put in the report, the S3A zoning district came in 1962. So after the Salt Dome was being the Salt Dome. And then PS wasn't created until 1975. So we tend to see in the county, in a lot of our areas where have longer established uses, including single family and other things, where we have zoning that doesn't really comport with what's on it or even with the GLUP. It's not an excuse, but it is something that occurs in a county that started, then adopted a zoning code, then changed the zoning code, then added other uses. So it is imperfect in that sort of human sort of way. Also, the PS zone is characterized somewhat as industrial, and it's actually, in some ways, if you go and look in the zoning code, it's more of an infrastructure facilities support. It's not industrial uses as enumerated in M1, which can be manufacturing, and things which we don't do anymore, which is actually still the zoning that's on the Buck site, because it was contiguous to the railroad, and I think Cherrydale Block was there at one point, and we had lumber yard there. There were other things, not to mention the bowling alley, but that wouldn't need M1, just depending on how good of a bowler you were. But it's just one of those sort of anomalous things. It is also the county's practice to not rezone or reglup land acquired for county use, whether it's a park or another facility, until a planning process is done, some form of a planning process. And we just did this, right, in the beginning of the summer when we had to rezone land in both McCoy and Benjamin Banneker parks, both of which went through some kind of community process. So there, that land had been acquired. That was that park. In fact, the McCoy family had given that land, and it still sat as our zoned land until there had been a process. Let's see. And we talked about the necessity of having it before the winter season. And I will say this, and I don't mean this to be flip in any way. And all of us have sat through varying numbers of listening to a CIP presentation, and I, up here probably being the one of most longstanding, have heard the most. And we always would bring up the Old Dominion site as needing a planning process. I think we can all remember that, and if I go back through the letters and things, I think I'll find it, because we knew that. And we would look at the fiscal 13, page C112, Northside Salt Facility, project description, salt storage structure will be replaced, and DES services, including mulch area, salt storage, and facilities for dispatching snow crews and installing tire chains, will be recognized on the site. Planning for the site will also establish a designated area for the potential future location of Fire Station 8 from its outdated facility. Well, we all know that didn't happen, but this is 2012, right? You know, it's not a surprise. So my sort of flip-sounding statement is the best guarantee and one of the real outcomes of this, which is a very unfortunate way of doing things, is that you actually will get the process. After all of these years, it is now moved to the head of the line instead of being pushed to the back and pushed to the back because other things came up. And it's horrible that it takes this. But that's what you have. And the county board actually coming out with the charge and trying and reaching out to people to construct the group is pretty amazing. It was lightning speed because, again, we talked about this in the CIP this year, and when we mentioned the planning, it was, oh, we don't know. So it can be small comfort, but I'm actually excited about the planning process, and I think all of you should be as well. So sorry for the editorial, because it will come to LRPC at some point. For the 2232, you know, the entire site does bear the crosshatch that indicates public ownership. And the site for the temporary structure is immediately adjacent to the current use. And these were some of the findings, some of the items that we used for Fire Station 8 for its 2232 determination, the new station. We all know that we do not yet have a facilities master plan in the comprehensive plan. That would be fiscal 2011 CIP, big page, C47, facilities master plan. We need to do one. One will start. It will be part of the comp plan. This, sadly, is not being brought along with the crisis that we have now. And it would certainly help, because then we would have some ways of being able to point to the facilities plan. But that is yet to be. So we fall back on things like the public ownership, the adjacency to the current use. We also know that in the 2232 reviews that we've had to do recently, we have goals in 11 elements that are often in conflict with each other, which is something that we will be working on as our planning staff looks at the comp plan updates on how to do some kind of matrix to figure out what those conflicts are and try to come up with some ways to resolve them when we run into them, some kind of guidance. But we weigh everything when we are looking at a 2232, including the history of a site and other factors. And also, while there are many uses available under PS as well as under S, there are other uses, right, than the storage under S3A and PS. So if we find this evening that this particular temporary use is in conformance with the comp plan, we are not precluding, at the conclusion of the comprehensive planning process, that something else that is proposed here through the plan could also be in conformance. You know, it's not mutually exclusive. So that means a lot to me, because I'm again excited about a planning process that we've been talking about for a very, very, very long time. So it is my intention to make a motion to both recommend the rezoning and for us to find that the use is in conformance with the comprehensive plan. Thank you. I do have some suggested topics for discussion. They're mostly sort of questions, but I think a lot of them have been answered this evening. I'm sure we'll have others to add to the list.
Yes, I'm looking at your, thank you, Commissioner Iacomini, and thank you for being our institutional memory. Truly appreciate it. I hope you take that as a compliment. There were a number of questions that Commissioner Iacomini offered us, including issues about the Buck site, steps taken to lessen the impact. I wanted to know myself what the tree preservation plan was, perhaps what, I think we're up to date on that, although there may be more information. So I just invite my fellow commissioners to raise some questions right now. We can put them down so we can have an orderly discussion. Does anybody have any additional? There you are. Okay.
Thank you, Madam Chair. So in addition, I also want to hear about the Buck site. I'm going to put this in the category of expected timing for use, definition of temporary. I'd like to hear more about why the leaf mulch site did not work, tree preservation, and for the efforts that are being used for tree preservation, how we are going to document and evaluate that. Related to that, the process for determining that keeping the trees that were removed as snags wasn't adhered to, so why we don't have snags, why we just took those out. Again, the DES mitigations to protect the water, and also any mitigations to protect the views to the neighbors, and other mitigations to preserve the trees. And then to the extent that you have something on the process or timing for the plan for the overall site.
Yes. Commissioner Schroll.
Yeah, a couple questions to add. I'd like to ask about the DES's Enterprise Asset Management Plan, which we kind of heard from one of our speakers, and also kind of partly part of that, just the frequency of inspections at the current Salt Dome and also the one in South Arlington.
Very good. Anyone else? Commissioner Ricks.
Yeah, I'd like to ask or get more clarification about the appropriateness of a temporary structure being used on a more long-term basis, possibly, versus a more permanent structure. And I ask that question in the context of the use of salt itself, which we all recognize is highly toxic and damages infrastructure and groundwater, et cetera. I'm imagining in 10 to 15 years the science is going to change on this and there might be some alternatives. So in light of that, since we have to go to a temporary structure anyway, would it not be expedient or maybe reasonable to plan a temporary structure that possibly could get used to bridge over to a point where a full-time or permanent salt structure is no longer needed?
Great. I think what we should do is go through those questions and get to that at the end. Meanwhile, you can be noodling on that. I would just want to add something at the end, which would be, I'd like to know from DES and perhaps CPHD as well, what are the lessons learned? Nothing is perfect. We strive for it. We never embrace it. But we learn from our mistakes, and to be honest about those, I think is important. I think questions about the enterprise management, which I've just learned about this evening, and snags and other new technologies could give us a way forward to embrace a principle, but see some flexibility in the way we embrace the the principle. I was very impressed by the list of principles that seem to be violated. And that's important. Those are important questions. Do we have black and white, or is there some way forward? Anyway, so I will, let's talk a little bit about the Buck site now. I think we've heard something. Commissioner Gearin?
Yeah, I would like to know how these suggestions to use the Buck site for a temporary salt structure conform with the current planning that's been undertaken regarding the Buck site.
Who do we have here actually who can speak authoritatively?
I'll give it a shot when it comes to the some of the zoning questions that may be involved on the Buck property. I'll defer to my more expert colleagues from the CPHD side. But I'll make the initial attempt. The reality of it is where we are today with the Buck site. Like if we were to say, okay, let's change our minds and do the Buck site today, we could not pull this off in time for winter, because it would have to do its own 2232 determination process. We have, and go through this a whole sequence on the calendar. We would have to do a parcel consolidation because the site where we put it is over a property line, if I'm correct, is it, George? And so we'd have to do a lot of the same actions that we're proposing to take here at that site. And though the calendar, the timeline, even though it's already paved, would put us into the January, February timeframe for completion. So that's just the reality of where we are today. I did bring this up with the board back in July. We had a matrix of a kind of a siting decision matrix that we put up, but we talked about it pretty quickly because it was an imperfect thing. It was a way to talk about it, but it's something we could have talked about for 5 hours and not yielded any, meaningful consensus. So when we talked about it, though, I think that the board, the comment I made, I believe resonated with the board, was that it's not an established use at that site. And though it's very difficult what we're doing in very short notice to the community and making this big change, at least at 26 and Old Dominion, within the neighborhood, it's a well-established use. Had we tried to go to Buck on such short notice with a use that had not been established in any way, shape, or form, we believe that that would have just been much more difficult with the community. And kind of hand in hand with that is we, since we're leading up to the purchase of the Buck property and its eventual purchase last fall, it's now under our ownership, we've been, I believe, doing a fairly good job of engaging with the community and JFAC on this process of educating about our needs and looking at the uses and going through the first process, and now we're moving through our phase, the next phase of determination and study of what we're going to do for interim uses at the site. And so I believe with the larger community with these multiple uses and with the people at the Buck site in particular, we built up some degree of trust that we're trying to follow through with what we said. The schools thing was an exception, and that was a separate process because it also reflects the dynamic nature of the mission of this, in that case it was schools, but we have our own dynamic needs in the county too. So that those long-term planning processes sometimes come in conflict with our unforeseen needs. So the 2232 process would not allow us to happen in time. We require parcel consolidation. It's not an established use. We hadn't addressed it with JFAC at all, trust. And as I believe one member of the committee said, Mr. Cook, there has been no community process, whatever. At the point when I engaged the board in late July, we had been engaging with the community at the existing site at 26 Old Dominion as best we could within the limited time we had. We had done absolutely no reach out or engagement with the Buck community And to go that direction at that time just seems like it would have a really broken faith with the community.
Thank you. I have a quick follow-up on that. That's very helpful to give us all some understanding, since that's come up a lot. Why not the buck site? The follow-up is, would it really be easier, as someone mentioned tonight, to use the buck site to distribute salt? Or is the location that we're in on 26th, given where salt has to go in the county, we didn't really see any of that as part of this, but we know there's one facility at the Trade Center, there's one up here in North Arlington. I'm wondering if part of this analysis is that the drivers already know these routes, it goes with existing use.
I discussed that over with my operational chief, Mike Collins, and we didn't do a complete, modeling and analysis, but our general feeling is, look, from a location standpoint, it may not be quite as good, but it was close enough to good. All the things being equal, which they aren't. So, I mean, it's not as far north, but from a location, it could work. Certainly, thousands of percent better than not having it at all. If there was some reason we couldn't do it at 26th and Old Dominion and that was our only choice left, and yeah, that would be a great site,
Commissioner Giacomini and then Commissioner Hughes.
I don't want to put Mr. Ross on the spot, but since he's still here, Mr. Ross is a member of JFAC. Would you like to come to the microphone, please? I don't care. So, sorry to put you on the spot, but I know that you are a faithful attendant at JFAC, and I know that Mr. Cook from Ballston, Virginia Square had attended meetings, JFAC meetings about the buck site. I've gone to a few of them myself, but you would have been much better since you're on JFAC yourself. And if you could just say just a little bit about what process that JFAC has already been going through with the buck site.
Yeah, if I can, it's been a little while. I have to recall some things. What we initially did was had some really open-ended discussions about all the uses. We had the DES folks show up there and show us all the different things that were needed for various operations throughout the South, whether it was salt facilities or a place to lay down construction equipment, emergency services for the county, the place where you put the confiscated cars from the police operation, quite a few other things like that. And we went through, I guess it was a 6-month process of discussion and open meetings. And I was talking with Ginger Brown, head of JFAC, about it. I said, Ginger, do I recall this? Because we just only recently heard about the discussions of proposals for the buck site. And I think initially, the salt solution was one of the possibilities. And I think we did get feedback from staff that they thought the 26th Street Old Dominion site was superior from an operational standpoint. I can't remember if it was clearly 80% superior or something like that, but it was the idea that I think it was the notion that it was an existing use there. But in terms of if it could be done, if you could install and put a salt facility there, I don't think there were any questions about that. I think it was the idea it could have been done. So anyway, we went through that, and so I think fairly early on we dropped the salt facility as one of our top ideas or considerations. We went through the process, and then a lot of back and forth with the community, and that was very important, working with the community. And we came up with our ideas, and I think it went through the county board process. And I think since then, I think it was alluded to, discussions have come up in terms of using it, and I think it's being used now from the school vehicle parking there now. But I think and that was one of the concerns or thoughts I had when I saw this idea of proposal for the Buck site outside of its uses was the sense of the community that we worked with or dealt with there. And that would have been my thought there, because we had on the Park and Rec side, we had all kinds of ideas for pushing for some playing fields there and buffering the site and all that. And so I think that was one of the concerns that was going on there was, gosh, we haven't talked to the, Collier Civic Association and quite a few other people. So I could probably think of some other things. I think there's a kind of an agreement. There's MOUs going on in terms of what is currently being proposed. And again, if we had just been starting the JFAC process right now this summer, or we were into it partially, and this came up, again, I'm sure it would have tinged our thinking about what was needed. So I'm not sure if that's that helpful.
But what I hear from you is that I think the Buck site is in phase 2, phase 3 of a long-range process, and it's undergoing sort of environmental and a traffic study now that's already been paid for by the county.
Yes.
So it's pretty far down. Not to mention the fact that, yes, it is now hosting the school White Fleet, and just since it's next to my neighborhood, the Ed Center is now been summarily made into a yellow bus parking lot by schools for the duration while the Ed Center is down, because then it will be 800 more seats for high school students. So there's quite a lot going on right down there.
And the last thing I think was being honest about it and hearing from some of the discussions and the concerns from the community, the neighbors right next door, about what the effect of was, to be honest, thinking about a salt facility and 24-hour emergency uses, early mornings, late nights, that type of thing. I could have thought you might have heard quite a bit from the neighborhood if that discussion had ensued there. So,
thank you,
JFAC
Mr.
thoughts. Okay.
It does sound like consideration of the Buck property for citing the temporary salt facility would have doubled down on the mistakes of not allowing a sufficient time for planning, which is what I draw from some of the things you said, and the fact that that process is really quite far down the road at this point.
Right.
Thank you. Thank you very much. Commissioner, nope. Anybody else on Buck property? Then let's talk about the temporary, what has been characterized as a temporary structure, facility, and including, I'd like to talk about how we can feature some language, maybe that's later in condition, that the zoning, I know if this were a GLUP issue, we could have a GLUP note, and I don't know how you would do that for zoning, to restrict. So let's start with how temporary is temporary.
Madam Chair, if you would entertain me just one more moment on the Buck. I have an astute staff member that's tuning in, and they share some good information, which I believe may help inform the discussion, in addition to the good comments that Mr. Ross had, where he had a striking recall of the various uses that were discussed, including the, police mobile equipment storage, material staging, and things like that. And there was some, I'm sure, amongst the discussions amongst the group and staff that they talked about a shift change building. But this is from an excerpt from the written report. It says there were 5 uses from the near-term needs that were not considered. Some of them were not considered because they were site-specific. These included the APS Career Center expansion, the Reed building expansion, and the county's replacement of the Salt Dome. So there's some talk about shift operations and snow generally, but not the Salt Dome per se. So that's just a minor clarification, and that's what was apparently was in the written report.
Thank you.
All right.
So now to the question of the structure itself, how temporary, and ultimately what are the assurances that it will be temporary, if there can be some?
Yes. the many statements have made by members of the community are true. The structure that we're buying could last longer than the period that we're intending to use it. I mean, you basically buy a structure strong enough to withstand the winds and the snow load and so forth. But from the very first discussions that I had with Rich Lolish and Alyssa Cowan and Mike Hogan, we approached them and said, look, we believe that signaling a canvas structure implies less permanence because it's not, as another person said, the type of permanent structure that we would want to do. So by choosing that type of thing, plus it's cost effective, it signals that that is not the permanent thing. So it's kind of like a thing of trust with the community that says this is not permanent. We also talked about the type of foundation and structure that goes with it. And for both practical reasons of getting it done, for practical reasons of us being able to work the site before we got a building permit, we also went with a foundation system for the arch canvas structure that is stacked concrete blocks. So you will see those appear on the site after we get the asphalt down. The foundation and the mast that holds the arch in place and against wind loads and so forth is stacked concrete blocks. And because that's not they're kind of Lego style, that's not a permanent foundation, like a traditional foundation design and structure that we would do. And when we approached those members of the community about that, they thought that that would also signal, as best we could given the situation, that it's not a permanent structure. So I still got to get a building permit, but it's the nature of the construction. We're doing the best we can to signal to the community that is truly our intent to make this temporary. Now, when it comes to temporary zoning, I'm a little bit out of my league, but we certainly asked that.
No such thing.
Exactly. I was told there is no such thing. So, I will simply say this. If that option were available to us, then I would be recommending it as a further sign of our commitment. But that option is not available to us. And you can
thank you very much, but am I incorrect in having read that when the fuller planning process takes place, that the zoning is up for discussion again, so it can be rezoned?
That's correct. So the rezoning would not be temporary, and rezonings cannot be conditioned, and so it will not be conditioned to limit the number of uses. I think that was something that we heard from one of the speakers, but that was not the intent of our words in the PowerPoint. It would not be temporary. It would not be conditional. However, as you just mentioned, the upcoming planning process will look at the zoning and the general land use plan categories for the entire 26 and Old Dominion site. So at that juncture, should a different zoning category be determined more appropriate, or a different general land use plan category be determined more appropriate, or a different use be determined more appropriate, then we could make those changes, and we'd need to have public hearings. We would go through LRPC. We would bring back 2232s. We would bring back rezonings. We would bring back, we would bring general land use plan amendments. So all of that will be on the table in the upcoming planning process.
Thank you for that clarification. I appreciate it. Anybody else? Commissioner Lantelmi?
To follow up on that, I also noticed that the rezoning does not have any restrictions on it. I was thinking that for discussion purposes, we could offer an amendment that would say something along the lines, now I'm not offering one yet, but maybe just so we could throw it out there and talk about, that until such time as a master plan for the rezoned site is adopted, only an interim salt storage facility and supporting and related uses shall be permitted.
I certainly think we can entertain that.
I would like staff's comment on that, because
Okay.
Yes, rezonings cannot be conditioned. A site plan or a use permit could be conditioned, but not a rezoning.
But the commission can express its desire or its understanding, its concern, its hope that the zoning will be reconsidered and finally determined once there's a planning process or some language to that.
Absolutely. You could make that recommendation in your letter to the county board.
In that way, but not as a condition on zoning, because we understand zoning can't be conditioned.
It could be that a motion that is made would be for the Planning Commission to recommend that the county board rezone, and then the final clause be with the understanding stated in the draft staff report dated September 5th, 2018, that all zoning on the site at the time of the creation of the task force will be examined and discussed during the planning process.
That language from the staff report?
No, I pulled that from my report.
You made it. Good. Okay. Well, we'll bracket that for now and revisit it when it comes time for motions. Commissioner Ricks.
Yeah, I just wanted to follow up on my question about temporary structure. And let me ask it in this way. If hypothetically we knew tonight that in 10 to 15 years we'd have a different way of treating de-icing chemically, would you think about this temporary structure in a different way? Since we may not know how that structure would be used in the future. In other words, would you consider a more, I'll say a more permanent temporary structure, but in terms of expense and site preparation and all the other things that will go into this project, would it not be prudent under those circumstances to think of it as more of a temporary structure, again, as a bridge to get us to a point where we understand what we're going to need in 10 or 15 years?
And sorry for not addressing that point earlier. It is my shared wish and hope that we can reach that point. How and when we reach that point, what date we can do that, and from a public works standpoint across the country, is a point of active discussion. Mike Collins, who I referred to earlier, is actively engaged in regional discussions and staying tuned to the technical discussions on this. Let me just share with you what we are doing right now to minimize the use of chlorides. You are aware already that we go with brining the roads, which significantly reduces the amount of salt and the amount of chlorides that get into the water. So we're doing that in the most nuanced and discretionary way that we can, while recognizing that weather forecasts are never perfect. And it's a tricky business because we only put it down if it's not going to rain before the snow, and sometimes it does anyway, or things like that happen. But the brining has reduced our use of salt, so that's helpful. But all the technical discussions and desires by people right now have, people are putting efforts in these areas, but the conclusion is where right now is there are no viable alternatives anywhere in the near term that are viable from either a efficacy that salt has, or from a cost standpoint, a logistical standpoint, to maintain public safety on so many roads in so many communities. So there's no breakthrough science yet, but it's something that people are working on. And to predict when that's going to occur, and to choose the structure that goes with it, we're open to receiving and taking appropriate action at that time when it actually does occur. But I don't think I could recommend at this time that we hold off and extend the interim use, in particular in regard to the commitment to the community to move on with the permanent structure. I think it's a great point as we do our master planning and choose the type of structure and choose where it's going to be on the site, it may very well be worth asking the question, well, what if salt does go away? What else could we use this structure for? And is it appropriately cited for that use, or how else could we reuse this structure? And maybe that will inform the size, the configuration, or the location of the structure that we choose to recommend on that site. So it's a good point.
Thank you.
Thank you. Anyone else? Commissioner Hughes.
Thank you, Commissioner Siegel. Would staff mind going to, I think it's slide 3, it's the one with the pictures or in the history of the salt dome real quick? Because Commissioner Ricks, by just chance, I was going to bring this up anyways, but can we keep going back? I want to go back to the dates real specifically when the water tower used that. Missed it. One more over, one more over. There, I think this is it. So I took a different approach when I thought about this, and I said, man, if we built a community facility today that nobody in this room was alive to see, was born when it was built, what would the community think of us? Think of the return on the investment on this water tank. Well, water did go out. I mean, luckily it's not holding water because that'd be really a good in iron, I guess. But I mean, man, 100-year-old building, that's incredible. That's an incredible ROI on the building, an incredible investment in our community. And it's not serving its original purpose. It's been an adaptive for use building. That being said, I don't think they build them out of steel anymore, riveted steel, that looks like marine grade and nice paint, but maybe we should. Not that I don't think you could design a better one, and I certainly hope that we would, but if we could build a building that could last 100 years while containing salt, we've already got the engineering done, I think. And that's a real question. My point simply is to say, I do hope that the planning process that comes out of this acknowledges the community facilities portion of this, the services providing to our community, and does not end with a temporary structure that is a 15-year structure, which I suspect your building will ultimately be, and I will find out whether I'm valid or not 15 years from now. I hope to be wrong, but I think that that's just how things work. But it would be aspirational to think about the next building not being a 30 or 50-year building, but to instead be a 100-year building as your challenge. So I'll leave it on that.
Those are all great points. And there's a number of factors we're going to have to choose when choosing the type of structure that we build for the permanent structure. Metal doesn't work well, even though here it has decayed over the years, and it was heavy steel. And I share your love of rivets. Trust me, I'm a fan of riveted bridges and other things. But over the long term, communities have chosen different types of structures based on their particular budgets that they have available at the time. Some people are choosing these canvas structure as their permanent. I'm hopeful that we're not going that way. It kind of depends on the building massing and so forth. But there are graceful arch structures that have as their underlying structure wood elements, which works well with salt as opposed to metal. Wood, and then there's a variety of different roof materials that go with a wood decking and so forth that can work. So they are unique structures because of the corrosive nature of salt. And you have to choose your fasteners and structural membranes very carefully, and that there's a range of structural options and shapes that you can go.
Commissioner Hughes.
I do want to quickly respond. Sometimes history is the best judge. And the Roman stone arches that still stand and the bridges you cross in Europe stand for 1,000 years. And when we build community facilities, it's important to look at what's succeeded. Mm-hmm. And I suspect that we'd have a hard time finding a VDOT concrete arch structure in the state that's older than this structure. And I agree with you. What we probably don't want to talk about is how expensive this structure would be to build today. That is some serious grade steel that has lasted that long. And but it certainly is aspirational to think about as a starting point to a hopefully a great planning process to come out as a challenge for a community to deliver a community asset that lasts at least as long as the one we currently have.
Although I would just point out that Commissioner Ricks is suggesting maybe we won't be using salt, and therefore what kind of structure would we build for this mystery substance that might replace salt? So anyway, I think we can, if nobody else...
The old building is an adaptive reuse.
Well, that's a very good point, and we certainly have gotten the most out of this 100-year-old structure, which actually looks quite artistic when you look at the way the rust is. So moving on.
Madam Chair, before we do that, since we're talking about the structure, I just wanted to recognize Mr. Smith being here and thank you for your remarks about something needs to be beautiful. And not just beautiful, but stately. And I know that as Commissioner Hughes has just noted, it can be more expensive. But this is a very prominent location, and it is at a node of the county with a church that has made a great deal of investment in itself and a university. So I think it will be incumbent in the planning process that we think of structures that are beautiful and that will are architect designed and not engineer designed, and have something, and I'll have to remember to find it and send it to you. There's a couple of years ago, there was a salt facility in New York City that has won design awards. And in fact, I want to say it was in Tribeca or Meatpacking District, someplace where people were dreading this thing, and then when it was built, it was amazing. I don't think we have to go to that price tag, but I'm just saying, governments tend to cheap out on themselves because they don't want to be perceived as spending money, but this is really spending money on the citizens and making a proud building. So I hope we add that to the thoughts and the process.
I'm very glad this discussion will be memorialized in a letter, because I think it belongs in the planning process that we will be anticipating. So we appreciate that.
Madam Chair? Could I just make one quick point on this discussion? We're using the word temporary structure, which is by nature pejorative. That's not really what I'm thinking about. I'm thinking more of a tensile or fabric structure, and they can look quite attractive and quite architecturally significant. They're very effective, and they're frequently used in open space, natural sort of environments like parks and open landscape. So that's what I had in mind.
Thank you so much for the clarification. Let's move on to, I think we could benefit from hearing a little more about why the leaf mulch site was inappropriate and didn't work.
Sure. I'll give you my best shot on that. I don't have the full, I have some backup slides possibly that I will not be able to put on the screen, but a few notes from when I briefed the board back in July. It too would have required the rezoning of that S3A parcel to go to PS. We would have required, I'm going from the premise that I got to have my leaf operations somewhere. So right now, the existing leaf operation runs roughly from like October, November through January. And how it functions is the vacuum trucks go out, or the leaf collecting the bags go out, and they make short, quick trips so they can rapidly cycle and take care of your neighborhood in a quick manner, given the size of the fleet that we have and given the personnel that we have it. So efficiently operate out of there where we've got heavy leaf canopy in the northern portion of the county. So they kind of rapid cycle in an efficient manner to that site, and they just dump and run. Now, if someone works the pile, and because we get a lot of leaves, and they build up the pile, and then those leaves with moisture and time start to consolidate, decompose, and we work the pile. And then, once we've hopefully met all your needs in the community, after our second pass of leaves and picked up everything that drops, mine personally don't drop until Christmas Day on my oak tree. And once all that's done, around Christmas time is usually when we can start moving them down to the trade center, because they've started to reduce in volume, and we can then get that smaller volume down to trade center and turn it into mulch. So there's a window of time where we have to have it there. Now, things like early snowstorms complicate things, and the weather can really add some variability to that. That entire leaf operation is driven by or confined by a use permit that was carefully construed and negotiated with the community on how long we'd be there and what the process would be and so forth. So if we were to try to relocate that function somewhere, I'm going under the operative assumption that, A, got to find a place that works, is big enough, is somewhere on the north side that it still fits with my operation, and that I can get a use permit done. And it introduces a whole nother process that I just don't think I could successfully get through in time.
Is this the only, this sounds like the composting of the leaves. I didn't understand that the volume was greater and then it composts down and then you can take it to the trade center, which is where people go and get mulch. Is this the only facility in the county that does that, or are there other leaf?
We also take some directly down to the trade center where we have it at the Earth Products Yard.
So down there.
You know, the huge portion of it goes right there at the leaf operations site.
I see.
Because there's no way at the trade center, it's not
Can
nearly large enough to receive it all. And then I would have to greatly expand my staffing and my equipment fleet, which I also don't have room to park, to try to do it at one location. So it's just simply not feasible at the trade center.
Anyone else on leaf, mulch? Commissioner Guerin?
Well, one reason I had raised this, thank you, Mr. Manuel, was because it seems like the leaf operation does not need a paved surface, whereas the salt does.
Actually, the leaf operation does need a paved surface because we work the pile. And because you don't know when the rains are going to come, and the mud, you need a stable surface to work off of.
For the machinery?
Yeah, for the machinery, the heavy equipment.
Moving on, let's talk about tree preservation. That was another subject that Commissioner Guerin wanted to talk about. Now, would you like to
Sure.
Frame that for us?
Yeah, so I had a couple of questions related to the trees. And one, which is a bigger discussion, and I'm just going to raise it because I think some of my colleagues want to talk about it, and that's the mitigations that'll be in place to protect for the run from any runoff, the mitigations visually, and then the mitigations, what are we going to do to protect the trees that are there? But then I had a different question related to the trees, and that was when I walked the site, when we had one of the tours, I raised the suggestion of, even with the trees that we knew we had to lose, could we retain them as snags? Because a dying tree still provides a lot of habitat and value. And I guess I want to know more about that, because it sounds like what I'm hearing tonight is you've already taken those trees out without considering them as snags. And I did raise them with DES staff, and I raised it with the urban forester and the urban forestry commission. So this was not a conversation I was having just among commissioners. I guess I want to know how that decision was made and how we might be more proactive about considering that in the future.
I'm going to have George for help here if he's maybe had any discussions with our urban forester.
Yes,
Vincent.
we did. Can you bring up the slide with the last footprint? Next one. All right. As we went through this process, we ended up with a condition you see on the right-hand side of that slide. The footprint that is shown there is the footprint of the structure. The asphalt pad is about 6 feet wider all the way around to provide the support for the bricks. So the 3 trees that are in red that were taken out are actually in the physical footprint of what we're going to build. The bulk of the trees that are in yellow, we did root pruning under the advice of the urban forester. And those are the ones that, as Greg said, we have a good probability of survival, but we have no absolutes there.
And would we consider retaining those as snags if they look like they're decaying, assuming we can cut them to a height that won't threaten any buildings?
Well, I think the probability is, yes, we could consider them as snags, but at some point we have to be cautious that they don't fall down on our structure, which is a canvas over steel trusses.
Understood. Okay, but we would consider it, or do we need to put something in our language?
Well, it is our intent today, with the work with the forester, we will keep the trees as long as they, and even if they're snags, as long as they don't create a hazard to the
Sure,
existing
a 6-foot
structure.
snag versus a 12-foot snag. That's very heartening. Thank you.
I would just like to suggest that the final plan as of August 31st, I don't think that's on the project page. Because I looked at the project page and I recall seeing the plan as of August 3rd. So just because it's been such an important issue for the community, we need to
We'll be sure to update that
Okay.
so it is quite clear what the physical footprint of the paving is going to be.
the trees that we hope to preserve too. Great, thank you. Anyone else? Commissioner Schroll.
Yeah, Mr. May, I appreciate the explanation you gave to Commissioner Gearin. I think the slide we have here would benefit from sort of the third slide, kind of the third picture, right? The 6 additional feet. So you can see, yeah, I think we talked about that, but I think that would be super helpful. Because, yeah.
Commissioner Gearin.
Okay, thank you. So related to this, if we are doing creative measures to try to save the trees and also reduce water runoff, can I ask that we document that and evaluate it at the end? Because it may be a best practices that we could replicate in the future and that we can learn from. I like this idea of trying to do the root pruning and seeing if we can save the trees. And I know that we worked with Vincent to save a tree on another site plan in East Falls Church. And to the extent that we can get some feedback, and I know it won't be right away, I think that would be helpful for us going forward. Look, we did this over at this project and it worked. It's worth trying. All right, thank you.
Excellent. Anyone else? If not, next topic is, I guess, Commissioner Gearin, I think you had suggested that DES sum up the various mitigations for water views, trees,
I
etc.
know the community is very concerned about the stormwater, but I also understand that you are taking some very serious mitigation measures to protect stormwater.
Yes, we are.
Can you give us a summary of that?
Well, the plans that we have, and I'm not sure the one that we have online reflects all of that. We're making a plan to deal with the runoff that actually hits the structure, the canvas. There is a trench on either side of the site that directs the stormwater directly into the storm drains. On the Old Dominion side, it runs into the paved area you see by the existing cylindrical tank and down onto Old Dominion to a storm drain, which is at the corner of Old Dominion and 25th. On the other side, there is a second trench. Each of these trenches contains a perforated pipe covered by rock to make sure we get no additional erosion. And it goes to a small retention pond that will be probably at about the 1 o'clock position on the circular tank. And then it will have an underground drain that goes over to 25th Street to an additional storm drain. So we've done everything feasible to limit that runoff from going anywhere other than in a controlled situation.
Anyone else on this topic?
One more, sorry.
Please, no, go ahead.
I'd love to hear from my colleagues, but I did have another question. This had to do with the visual mitigation. We've also heard there's some concern about this building's going to be a bit taller than what's there now, and it might stand out a bit, and it hasn't been designed with the sort of architectural beauty that we're hearing from both other commissioners. Yeah. So can you tell us what we can expect in terms of visual mitigations?
Well, there's, I think the visual mitigation that we can expect is what you have right now. I mean, and I'm going back to my brief comments that I made about the efforts I made several years ago when we had the opportunity to plant some trees. And given where it sits on the site, we haven't done a visual here to show what this looks like with the structure in it yet. We haven't done that. It will be significant. We're not pretending it won't be. But the street trees that we planted, there's some deciduous and there's some coniferous trees. Also, there's some a few hollies and so forth in there that'll help block that more in the winter. So I think we have what we have right now, and until we master plan the site, there's not a lot more that we can do. We're thinking about doing some more work on the perimeter where we think it might be safe, but it's a judgment call of trying to figure out, is it really worth the effort and the risk of then having to remove that tree? But you do bring up a related and interesting mitigating point. We very much want, as part of this master planning, to not just look at where the buildings and functions go on the site, but what the related mitigation is on the perimeter of the site and what the options are on the site for visual mitigation, for noise mitigation, for light mitigation. And I think that's truly a creative space that we need to spend time in. And George and I have also had this discussion similarly on the Buck property. And I think if we can try some things and maybe evolve a standard or a range of options so that these types of light industrial functions can more peacefully coexist within residential neighborhoods with a good mitigating buffer treatment, I think they will be more accepted in the community. And that in turn, depending on the height of that mitigating thing, if it's it's a brick wall, a stone wall, or a landscape wall, or whatever it is, the actual on-street view that you see of that, you may never see that structure behind you at all. So I kind of want to look at it holistically, including the perimeter treatment. I want to make that a big part of the study, and that's how we're trying to draw up the statement of work that we're doing.
Commissioner Hughes.
I just want to make a quick comment on this because I think what I heard from the county staff is a sentiment, and I think it's a sentiment that's also in our school staff, and I think it's a sentiment that's in our developer staff and our landowner staff, and it's an acknowledgement we must have as commissioners and as a community as well. We must acknowledge that we hope that trees are permanent, but we don't live in a forest. That's the truth. I would love to say that we do, but we don't. And we should not be thinking about whether planting a mitigating tree that may only be a 10-year tree is a risk to our future planning, because we will no longer be allowed to place a building there because of a tree. So there is a balance that we need to begin to acknowledge in our planning, and I don't know how to say that we do, but it's just something that I think as commissioners we should think about. The trees are important. As someone who told the school board that I saw no public value in cutting down a tree 3 people could not hug together, I appreciate trees, and I acknowledge that in the future we must plan, but I fear that if we obsess about preserving all of the trees everywhere all the time, that we will lose out on opportunities, just as DES has done in the past, to plant beneficial trees that may be temporary, knowing that the choice as a manager between planting a temporary tree and knowing that it will endanger my future planning, and the choice of maybe providing 10 years of mitigation and stormwater reduction. And we have to begin to think about that as a community. And I don't know how to do it, but to my other commissioners, I think it's something we should think about as we approach them.
I think, as usual, Commissioner Hughes, you've given us a novel and well-defined point of view to consider, and I'm somewhat moved to continue to think about it. Commissioner Iacomini.
Well, actually, building on what Commissioner Hughes has said, since we are also sort of opining a little bit about the process, and thank you for sharing your thoughts on that, is that, we will be starting, I believe, the urban forest master plan in the coming year. So in some ways, this particular site might be an interesting microcosm of thinking about the urban forest. And I have experience with, 2 40 dBH oaks that are being threatened by in my yard, being threatened by other development, but they may stay, they may go. And that whenever we seem to really put all of our hopes in saving the bigger trees, we really don't think about how a forest really works. And that is, And in fact, we deforest every day in our gardens when we pull up the seedlings, right, from the oaks and the maples, because that's how a forest works. It has the big trees, and it has medium size, it has understories that will always be understory, and it has little baby trees because they'll start growing, they'll get naturally selected, the big trees will grow. But humans have interrupted that in Arlington County with buildings, right? That's what happens. But maybe on this site we can start thinking about, in the planning process, how is it that we balance the big trees? Where do we plant trees that will become canopy trees? Where do we have our middle trees? Where, Commissioner Guerin would say, where is our meadow or part of that? It's all, what does it mean to be an urban forest, and how can we look at that and think about it so that we are not always in the position, as Commissioner Hughes says, of saving, of needing to save or feeling we have to, the big tree, and therefore might not get some trees planted for an interim use, but yet really select where we can put some of our canopy trees that they will remain, and that we have all of that going on. And this might be an interesting site to start thinking about that, and I'm hopeful in the Urban Forest Master Plan they will be thinking about that as well. And just as a sort of something that you mentioned that I would suggest for the county board hearing, and that is you should drop in the structure in these pictures or have another set of pictures, because we would all have required that of a developer, now that I think about it, right? Aren't we always asked to see the proposed structure in context? And we sort of let you off lightly with this one, but I do think that people should see that for whatever it's worth, whether it's horrifying or not. And frankly, I would do a perspective or a drawing that takes in all four corners. How is it in relationship to Marymount and to St. Mary's and to the single family across the street? Just because people are saying how much taller it is than St. Mary's Spire, and I'm not sure of that, but if you all did some drawings, then we would have that.
Thank you very much. If there's nothing else on this, Commissioner Ricks.
I just wanted to ask if the site ingress and egress will remain the same for the temporary structure?
Yes.
No alteration?
One of the original concepts that we had an additional entry point, but when we moved it back closer to the original location and took away the salt pile, we were able to stick with the existing curb cuts.
Thank you.
Anyone else? Okay, I think we have one more topic that we said we would cover. This has to do with enterprise asset management. New concept to me. Perhaps, Mr. Manuel, you know about this and can enlighten us.
Sure, I will take an initial stab at that, and maybe George can embellish. We've been doing asset management for some time now. We do facility condition assessments. They do form the basis for our planning and our requests within the CIP, the annual budget process. But as in all things local government, we don't always get what we ask for. And so those are the challenges and trade-offs that we face. The requirements here have been known for some time. We did request them in the CIP. We requested planning, I think, like 4 years ago, and got approval for planning. And then we requested money for the permanent structure, I think 2 years ago, in a bond cycle, and got funding for the actual structure. The thing that we did not anticipate, but what happened is that the Fire Station 8 and the salt structure timing and process and location diverged. When the community and the board went a different way than we had originally envisioned in our CIP with Fire Station 8. So that's kind of where our sequencing that we had laid down took a left turn or whatever. So that's what happened. But we had laid in the money and the resources to do the planning and and have obtained approval. And fortunately, we're using some of that money for the construction now for the temporary structure. So that helps us through our current financial situation to actually build the interim structure.
I know that for schools and Metro, the county's budget took a big hit because our the revenues from commercial real estate went down. We have a high vacancy rate. So there was pressure. There were big pressures on the budget. Did that affect the particular needs you envisioned for this site and the permanent structure? Were you one of the heads that had to roll on that?
The CIP and the $2.4 million, I think, is what we had put on as a notional amount in the CIP when we put it previous cycle for the cost of this structure. At that time, though, it assumed some simultaneous site development with the fire station. And so some of the access into the site we thought would be built with the fire station and some shared use asphalt, and all be very efficient, but it didn't turn out that way. And so now any site development has to be borne by this project. So it's, you know, it's likely going to go up, but you know, it'll be informed by this planning process that we're going to do. That was a notional amount, and but yeah, I mean, we were fully aware of its condition and laid in some of the funding, but the planning process kind of diverged, and then it became an issue basically of planning capacity, I think, within the community and within the staff.
Anybody else? Commissioner Schroll.
Mr. Manuel, I know you mentioned just now that staff obviously was well aware of the condition, sort of generally of the salt dome, and became more aware in April about its unsafe nature. Could you or Mr. May speak to how frequently structures like this go through kind of an intensive inspection, and also speak to kind of where things stand with the one in South Arlington? I know that's not before us this evening, but.
So we do periodic updates. They're on kind of about a 5-year cycle now for our facility condition assessments, where we try to look at them comprehensively and update our overall needs and relook at the priorities and relook at conditions. So that's on kind of about a 5-year cycle, as long as we can get the funding for doing that analysis, because there's consultant money that's involved in getting that done as well. So that's generally how we approach it. Different structures, though, have different inspection cycles. Like, you know, so if, like, our bridges have a different inspection cycle, and if they're in a certain condition, then we'll have a more frequent inspection cycle. So there's some variability. Or if we know that we're having trouble with a roof, we're having leaks more frequently, then we'll put it on a more frequent inspection basis, and maybe accelerate where it is. The point I'm making in all that is that no matter what inspection cycle or frequency you set up, it's never perfect, and judgment isn't called, and you're never going to hit it just right. The art of all this is using enough engineering judgment and, you know, history and experience to try to hit your target most of the time, where you're replacing that roof and getting the maximum life you can out of it, but you replace it just the day before it leaks. And that's just simply not realistic. You know, if you've maybe experienced that on your own home or something. So, you know, we go across those principles and so many portions of the building envelopes and structures that we face. It's a judgment thing, and you just try to use best practices to try to get it right.
So that's helpful. So with the other salt dome, when was that constructed? Kind of how far are we into its useful life?
I don't have the details on it, but it was within the time that I've been here. So I'm thinking it was about 8 to 10 years ago that it was built down at Trades. And so it's got 40, 50 years easily, yeah.
Okay, yeah. I understand that these are difficult things to try to get right. I know a lot of this is out of your control. It's up to the county board and others to determine sort of what goes into the CIP and things. So it's all blame, obviously, on your shoulders, Mr. Emanuel, or yours, Mr. May. But yeah, we would endeavor to replace it a year or two before the roof fails, just to save us this and ensure that we also live up to our better angels as a community to make sure that the planning happens to.
Exactly.
I think most people would pay a little bit more to make sure we did it right and put it in the right spot. But I know we're here under other circumstances this evening, so thank you.
Thank you.
Thank you very much. Does anyone else have any other comments on any topic? And Commissioner Iacomini.
Just because people have asked, and it sort of works with how temporary is temporary, that we will have a robust planning process. And it sounds like the stakeholders have ideas and county staff does, and we've all been involved with planning processes on this dais, and so they can be short, they can be long, but the point of it is to have a robust process that really digs down to people's desires and thoughts about land, and then builds up from there, getting all the pieces on the table and figuring out how to arrange them. So do we have a thought? Are we thinking a year, 2 years? I mean, I know we don't want it to go on forever, but we want to give it time that it's not rushed so that it can be thoughtful and we can work with the structures and work with all the pieces.
Yeah, well, I will say that we originally laid out in July about a 9-month process is what we were envisioning. That was our kind of our first guess going into it. I think that's evolving now. I'm not sure when it's going to start and when it's going to end. And I think that that will emerge from the board's deliberations later this month. But I think that one positive note I will, and one of the speakers mentioned this, I think it was Mr. Hogan, one positive thing is that the community has in some ways come together, at least certain members of them, have come together on kind of getting their heads wrapped around what they're interested in. So it's not always that we go into a planning process with the benefit of a really relatively recent community effort to inform the process. And so I think that will help the process.
Well, I think that's true, but I would encourage us in the process to not just rely on that as a starting point, but to sort of step back and really engage all the stakeholders and all the people that will be at the table to say, what are your hopes and aspirations for this site? And that includes staff. And then there's all the pieces, and then you start figuring out what fits, what doesn't, how can maybe 2 or 3 things be accommodated. So it can be a great gateway and a node in the county there, considering Marymount and St. Mary's. So, I want to assure people that temporary means it'll only be there for a year, but frankly, if you want a really good process, it's going to be, this temporary will be there for a little while.
Yeah, I think we
but
tried
only, I think, till we have the planning process wrapped up and figure out the money and then the construction timeline.
Exactly, that was the point I was going to make, is even after we wrap up the planning process, I've got to get George to successfully funded for design and construction, and the phasing of any mitigation efforts that go with it.
Commissioner Hughes.
Thank you. I just want to make sure it's on the public record that in a follow-up to Commissioner Iacomini's excellent points about a good process that definitely should go on here, because I hope, again, that we have an 80-plus-year-old building to serve our community. But I do want to mention that word community, because I think we are now at a position, Fire Station 8 was done, and the service area for Fire Station 8 is a definable area. However, we saw in our conversation and our public testimony tonight how the impacts of having this salt dome, or maybe if it doesn't a salt dome in the future, which I concur with Commissioner Ricks, at this site impacts not only this neighborhood, but many neighborhoods all over our entire county. And so when looking at the composition of how we structure a community team of people to think about a site, I hope that we look broadly and define our community with how this building will benefit it.
Very good. Commissioner Schroll.
Thank you, Madam Chair. Ms. Tulloch Rhodes or Ms. Smith, question for you about 2232s here. I'm wondering if you could help me through the kind of process here. I mean, considering the 2232 now, they don't have a building permit yet to do this project. Some work has been done on the site, obviously, to scrape the site. And so I'm wondering if you could kind of help me with when we need to approve the 2232, what can't be done prior to that, what can be done. Because we've seen some 2232s for schools where some work was done and then we were asked to approve a 2232. We've seen some, like with the parks, like Commissioner Giacomini said, where the planning was done and work hadn't been done actually yet prior to work being done. So I'm wondering if you could kind of help me understand how it's intended to go, I guess, going forward.
Well, we are recommending that the 2232 finding be done at this juncture. That would allow this to move forward. 2232s have been done at different times. Staff is actually going to be starting a process to look at our 2232s in greater detail. And we imagine bringing forward maybe some different ways to represent features on the general land use plan as part of the GLUP reprint process effort that is also ongoing. Some of this is evolving, but we would recommend that the finding be made now so that we can move forward.
Sure, yeah, I mean, I certainly understand that that request is being asked now. It's just, I know the salt dome's here, and so I agree with Commissioner Giacomini's point about the sort of like this is very similar to the the issue with the fire station, which is it's a use that's very similar. It's happening adjacent to the existing use. I'm not as concerned about that piece. I'm just kind of concerned about the kind of timing of scraping a site and then being. And I know we didn't meet in August, and I know there were some logistics there, and I know you're trying to get this done. So I get there's a time press, but I'm also just wondering about the timing of asking for something that you've already kind of done part of, and then asking us to kind of rubber stamp a piece of it, as we did with the schools, I guess, last year.
So I would say in this circumstance that the activities that have been started are something that can occur with the zoning that's in place today. So the zoning, of course, is needed to facilitate construction of the temporary facility, and that construction, those steps of the construction won't be happening until the zoning occurs. In terms of the 2232, our conclusion, and that's our recommendation to the Planning Commission, is that the use is really already established here on this site. And so from the macro level, at the general land use plan level, we're saying that that is already a feature shown. Now, if we think about it in a more general sense, not specific to this use, what the 2232 should come before you before we establish a new use. So we should have, if we were looking at another site where the facility is not there, we would be bringing the 2232 to the Planning Commission before we establish the use. Now, establishing the use could be taken under a number of ways. It could be before the board really establishes a contract to pay for A&E, architectural and engineering, with an extensive amount of money that can then be the first wave towards construction. In this instance, the 2232 is coming before you or concurrent with the rezoning before they take the steps to actually construct this facility.
That's helpful and a good reminder of those different steps. What I would say to staff, though, I think the wider community doesn't always appreciate some of that nuance, and the actions taken to scrape the site was viewed, and maybe appropriately so, that was the action that kind of kicked things off, and so some of the things we're going to be asked to do are sort of moot now because you're already kind of down the path to do some of this work, and so the trees are gone, and so some of the other things that follow, well, all separate actions, and obviously the county had the ability to do it under the existing zoning, still don't, I think, help you all in the trust side of the coin when you're trying to kind of do these things.
So two things to that. I would say that in July, Greg was the one giving really the majority of the presentation, and it was noted that some of these steps were going to be necessary in order to have the site ready for November. And that's that the board understood that as part of the presentation, and we were trying to be as clear as possible. I would also say that tonight is not the first meeting where this topic is coming up. So usually the 2232 review process is not the first thing that the community will hear about. It is something that usually lags behind. In this instance, the community conversation has been shorter than normal, and I think we all recognize that. But there has been conversations, starting with some informal conversations, but there was a public hearing to request authorization by the board in July, and so there's been continued conversations as well. That this is something that would be necessary and would have to come to the Planning Commission. I do think that it's a valid point that you make about the nuance of
Yes, it goes under the heading of lessons learned. What do you draw from an experience that's not optimum? And in this case, I appreciated, Mr. Manuel, your analysis that that this site and what was needed for maintenance of the existing salt structure was complicated in ways I'm not entirely clear about by the Fire Station 8 issue that was supposed to come to the site and then didn't. To me, that says that's a good reason to persist in pursuing a community facilities element in the comp plan, because there you have the ability to do more strategic planning, looking at all sites and sort of keeping our community eye on the ball. So to me, that's an important lesson learned, and I think that's the value. It's another value of misfires like this. It tells us where we need to shore up our planning, our strategic planning, and grasp of what needs the county has and how to best balance them and fulfill them. If there's no other comment on anything, then let's proceed to motions. Commissioner Iacomini.
Thank you, Madam Chair. I move the Planning Commission advise the County Board adopt the ordinance to rezone 4 parcels RPC numbers 030-63001, 002-003, and the eastern portion of 004 associated with the property known as the Salt Storage Facility located on Old Dominion Drive between 25th Road North and 26th Street North from S3A Special District and R61 Family Dwelling District to PS Public Service District for the purpose of providing an interim structure to store and distribute salt during winter weather events as shown in attachments 1 and 2 of the draft staff report dated September 5th, 2018.
Second? Second by Commissioner Gigerin. Is there discussion? If no discussion or further amendments, all in favor, raise your hand. All opposed? Any abstention? That's 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7, 8, 4, 0, 0. Commissioner Iacomini.
I move the Planning Commission find per Virginia Code Section 15.2-2232 that the proposed character, location, and extent of the interim salt storage facility is a feature shown on and is substantially in accord with the goals and policies of Arlington County's comprehensive plan, with the understanding stated in the draft staff report dated September 5th, 2018, that all zoning on the site at the time of the creation of the task force will be examined and discussed during the planning process.
Is there a second? Second by Commissioner Schroll. Any discussion? Commissioner Hughes.
Thank you, Commissioner Siegel. I do support the building, and I think I want to compliment our own staff on seeking out appropriate zoning and albeit rushed planning process to fit the site. As those of you on the commission have known, my 2232 positions are quite fun. I have hence to this point so far supported those determinations on county facilities, although I began to abstain on them for school facilities for the purposes of the fact that we were missing a comprehensive plan element. If we were simply talking about the restructuring and the rebuilding of the site, I believe I would be in support of the motion. It's not that I'm against the motion, but I do see that last year I was quite adamant about that I was supporting our 2232 motions in the hopes that we'd be coming forward with a maybe joint facilities plan, maybe a county facilities plan, or maybe a schools facility plan. And as of yet, that planning process has not come forward. It's not that I do not support what you've ultimately proposed, but my intentions this evening are to abstain from the 2232 determination, as I have begun to do with schools, in the hopes, albeit futile and lonely, that one day we may actually have a comprehensive plan element that more further guides our community in understanding what facilities are necessary. So it is not my intention to show my non-support for your motion, Commissioner Iacomini. However, it is my goal to continue to stand lonely in the hopes that one day we may have a comprehensive plan element that includes both community facilities for the schools and the county now.
Thank you, Commissioner Hughes, for not only your explanation, but your consistency. Don't feel lonely. I think we are instructed by it, even if we don't actually join in your methodology. So any other comments? No comments. If not, all in favor of the motion, raise your hand. All opposed? Abstention. The lonely abstainer. Very good. That ends the public portion of our meeting. Thank you very, very much for attending and for all of your comments. Appreciate it. We maybe take a 5-minute break and have some of Commissioner Iacomini's food. And then we can return here in 5 minutes and finish up. was it you? Okay. The approval of July 2nd, 2018 meeting minutes.
Madam Chair.
Sir.
I move, have you moved them?
Yes, please move them.
Okay. I move adoption of the draft minutes from the
July
Arlington County Planning Commission meeting dated Monday, July 2nd, 2018.
A second? No second? Commissioner Giacomini seconds. Any discussion? All in favor? Raise your hand. Okay, all opposed? Abstentions? So we've got 800. Do we have a staff report? Ms. Bowling? No staff report. Okay, very good. Ms. Johnson, no staff report. All right, staff report on current matters. I just want to say the Site Plan Review Committee, I want to talk about the Citizens Guide. I want to thank everyone so far who sent me comments. I will respond to each and every comment. I owe James some comments, and I owe Jim some comments. If you still want to send comments, please do. I would just list a couple of the comments I've gotten, sort of groups of comments. The what I called consensus building, a lot of objection to that. I went back to, I actually discussed it with Eric Gushel because he urged me, as I was rewriting the operating guide, to consider putting in language about consensus. And so I went back to him with the concerns that several people raised, that we do not build a consensus as if we were lobbyists or political operatives, but rather we try to identify consensus. I felt we did something just a bit more than that, and he suggested that what we do is we seek consensus. We try to find it. Sometimes we redefine a problem that's put on the table in 3 different ways, and we define it in such a way that we can present the board with we can present the board with some coherent views from the community, rather than simply listing them as if we were a recording secretary. Yes, please.
Madam Chair, as I was one of the ones who provided you comments along
these
lines.
You were.
I think there's a difference. I would disagree with seeking as well. I think I would differentiate it that we discern the different viewpoints, or we identify where there might be consensus and where there isn't. But I think the kind of verbs like seek or things along those lines make it seem that it is our job to be on the side that is the consensus side. And I think my take of SPRC and the Planning Commission role in that is to lead the process and then point out to our fellow planning commissioners where the majority was, where the minority views are as well. Issues might be with a project, so that we can take them up as planning commissioners and then provide our best advice to the county board on the comp plan. And so I think that's where I would recommend us going, and sort of stepping back from talking about consensus as something that is the goal of the process. And I think that's kind of my trouble with how that section read to me. I know it's a difficult thing to work through, Madam Chair.
That shouldn't stop us.
Sure, but that would be my feedback.
Okay.
I would be happy to talk with you kind of offline. I know it's getting late, and we've had a number of late nights this week, so I'm happy to chat with you more about
I very, very much appreciate that, because I do want to plumb the experience that people have had about this. As I say, 2 board members have talked to me about this. Christian Dorsey also mentioned this. And I think I take what you said, and I think that might be workable, because we're not just coming in and saying, well, what does Mr. Smith think and what does Ms. Jones think, and we're simply going to tell the board, we're going to give a laundry list. That isn't what we do. We do some summation, and we do some identification, reframing maybe. There's a nuance there that I really want to capture. From the perspective of board members, what struck me in the conversations I've had with the 2 board members was that it is just more helpful to them when they really get a strong consensus, because then they can act more forcefully. When they have something sort of piecemeal, and that doesn't mean they don't get minority views or outstanding issues. We cannot resolve every issue as we were instructed for 11th and Vermont. That was sort of a painful experience, but we learned from those. So I'm open. I want to get consensus with everyone to represent something that we can present to the wider community in non-technical terms. I think it's really, really important that we do that sort of outreach. Having said that, Commissioner Giacomini suggested that maybe there are 3 audiences we're trying to reach. Bob Duffy and I did think that to go through this sort of fundamental identification of the role, the goals, what are we all about, rather than a listing of the choreography of what we do in SPRC, was important, and that we could add the technical steps in hot links and attachments. However, I'm now thinking that I should also, once we do the Citizens Guide, which Commissioner Gearan suggested we name it, and I think that's a good idea, go back to the current operating guide and take another look at that and see if that can carry the weight of this sort of choreography that I think some people, not all, rely on. So I'm going to do that as well. I'm a glutton for work and punishment, so I will go ahead and do that. Anybody else want to just discuss? Yes.
I want to support what Commissioner Schroll just said. I think that's a very important distinction, that even when we identify areas of consensus, it doesn't mean we agree with them. So I think that there's an important semantic difference here, and I'll point out, for example, the street at Stratford. Every appointed commission felt that was a foolish idea. Staff did not support it, but the neighborhood really wanted it, and that's why they're getting it. And it was really important to identify that. So I think that's a really important distinction that you raise. When we're talking about consensus and we say build or create, it does imply that we're on the same side, and that's not necessarily always the case.
Okay, just to respond very quickly, this is very, very helpful to me. So I am going to, I think I'll start with your language, which I've taken down. I'm going to circulate it again, and we will put something together that we all like. So thank you again for that. Just Commissioner Stephen and then Jim.
Thank you, Commissioner Siegel, and for reminding those of us who may be remiss in providing you our comments back. But I do want to quickly associate myself with Commissioner Schroll and Commissioner Gearing. For those of you who know, I sometimes hold very minority viewpoints, but I think for those of you who have sat in on the SPRCs I chair, I don't think anybody ever would feel that way from seeing my chairmanship of them. And I think that's a very important thing to remember in this process, that we are not advocates for our own position, that our job is to help move and lead a community process, because our community has to be built and changed, and we have to facilitate that delivery. So I do think that it's important that we work on this guide, and I think that resending it's excellent, but I do want to make sure I associate myself with Commissioner Schroll.
I appreciate that. Thank you.
And as I had mentioned, I think also in comments to you, that if there are times when the SPRC does not develop a consensus, that does not mean the SPRC was a failure. Right. It simply means we've identified that this is an area that we simply could not come to a consensus. And that's information that needs to be put forward. Yes. It's not a failure. It's simply information.
Great. It's very helpful. David.
I agree with all of this. I think we have to be careful about the words we use which imply overpromising. And consensus is the goal, but from my short history here, I see that it's rarely attainable. So we shouldn't build up expectations thinking or promoting that consensus is the outcome.
Lack of consensus is also sends the important message to the we can't.
Well, I think SPRC is a place where consensus can happen, and that's why we have it. We have all the stakeholders at the table and the other boards and commissions, as well as the neighborhood and staff and the applicant. So everybody can hear each other, and hopefully it establishes a place, as I said, where consensus can happen. So, and we identify it and move along. And I agree with everybody who said, as Commissioner Rick said, we have to be careful about our words.
Oh, yes. I've rewritten that piece maybe now 5 times. I'll do it 10 times till everybody is easy with it. Daniel.
I think that the language that you initially mentioned, the idea of discerning consensus in areas for further discussion, is really powerful language. I also saw Commissioner Akamini pop up when she heard that. I think maybe for similar reasons is why it struck with me.
Repeat it.
Discern areas of consensus and areas requiring further discussion. I would actually go a step further than what Commissioner Lentelmi said and say that not only is it not a failure if there is no consensus, that identification of issues requiring further discussion is in fact a great success of the process. It's a more risky error to present a consensus where in fact consensus does not exist than it is to present topics that require further discussion when in fact everyone actually, after that discussion, you find out that everyone actually agreed all along.
Then here's a question. Instead of calling this section consensus or consensus seeking, consensus building, consensus identification, what would you call it? Because there will be
identifying areas of consensus and areas requiring further discussion. It's not short, but that's what the purpose is.
Madam Chair.
Yep.
So, and I don't have it before me, but there's another section that you walk through the objectives or kind of goals of SPRC. And I think that's the kind of crux of what you need to convey, which is what do we actually do? What are the kind of steps we go through? Because as others have said, it's not always clear what we're actually going to get out of it. And so I think it's probably better to define what we're going to do, what the process is going to be, the things we're going to discuss, who might want to be at the table, and then maybe our aspirations, but not necessarily the outcomes.
Okay. I will reread it to make sure I'm not going in that direction. Thank you. Thank you. Really appreciate it. Send me comments. I'm happy with the sort of the way we've gone through this, and I thank you for that, because we usually do a red line strikeout, but I personally just don't feel that conveys. When you get different styles kind of conflicting, you don't get the message through. So I really do appreciate your help on this and supporting this effort. And then I'll take a look at the current operating guide, and maybe we just fix that up and have that also as an operating guide, the choreography, the process. So that's enough. It's late. Do we have long-range planning? More work for Nancy Akamini?
No, I think what we might have is Public Space Master Plan and the PAMP, the Public Art Master Plan, on which other people will present at an LRPC meeting, but I don't see those as coming until later in the year. think they've been pushed back some. We will have the bike plan element coming. And James, when was it? It was October when you were looking to use the date. I think that's right. I believe staff will also be ready to talk about special glut process, perhaps, and getting out something on that. It is unwritten, so I think they're working on something to do with that. And as you heard, there's still 2232 process that they're working on. They keep getting interrupted with salt domes and things like that.
Super. Thank you very much. Soko?
Thank you, Commissioner Gearin. There are two issues that are, for our purposes, percolated. For staff's purposes, still percolating, but they'll come in before us in October. The first is two-family dwelling non-conforming issues. I believe that I've seen all of us here at the meetings there, so you all are mostly familiar with those, but it has to do with interior and exterior alterations to two and sometimes one family dwellings that are non-conforming in two-family, multifamily districts, as well as some technical amendments, emendations to some of the ZO that for the purposes of administering some of the processes. The other one that we most recently met on has to do with zoning regulations applicable to community pools. For the benefit of those who were not at the meeting, the precipitating circumstance is a pool in Green Valley, Knock, that was historically associated with the YMCA community center, was functioning as a lowercase c, lowercase p community pool, and a developer would like to redevelop it now into another lowercase, a better lowercase c, lowercase p community pool. Interestingly, their perspective was that it was a community center. I guess staff, that it was an accessory use to a community center. I guess staff asked them to submit it as a capital C, capital P community pool, which then subjects it to a number of very stringent provisions of the zoning ordinance pertaining to community pools, provisions that are younger than the 5 existing community pools, and provisions that are not met by any of the 5 existing community pools. But the board does not presently have the authority to apply any to be flexible in the application of those provisions. And so the study is at essence about what flexibility would it be appropriate for the board to have in site requirements, parking, fencing, facilities, setbacks being the biggest one, because really we're talking about it's if you look at it at Google Maps, the pool's there. It's been a pool for a long time. The owner wants it to continue to be a pool, but the setback requirements that were written for a much less densely populated Arlington County would preclude what would otherwise be something I think everyone wants. But it's going through the process that it's going through because we don't want to spot change the zoning ordinance. Both of these will be coming up in October. And the RTA we won't hear the RTA, but the board will be approving that probably next week.
Yeah, carry on.
Would this precipitated zoning change apply to just existing structures or to all public pools, community pools?
It would apply to, well, that's part of the study. What staff has presented to us would not change the actual use requirements. It would provide the board some flexibility in the application of the use requirements, right? Taking into consideration the specifics of the site, right? So if a potential seventh community pool were to, if someone wanted to build a potential seventh community pool, right, then the question, the study isn't just saying, well, what makes this pool work? The study is also saying, how would the board think about how to evaluate and what flexibility to apply to the existing requirements for this other one? Does that answer your question? I don't know that I don't think, okay. As long as you think it does.
Well, I just was wondering if they were thinking of this in terms of level of tolerance for existing structures that pre-exist current zoning.
I think that is among the facts that the board would have to weigh if they were to have this kind of authority to be a little bit more flexible in applying site plan conditions. That would be part of their sort of structured decision making. Is this new construction, or are we talking about something that is a current pool in the ground?
That sort of logic would be consistent, like we see. You're afforded more flexibility.
Well, and one of the things that came up was, and we'll get this in the presentation, was what's the difference between this pool that is a pool on the one hand and a vacant parking lot on the other hand that someone wants to turn into a community pool, right? And what distinguishes the two of those things, and how would the board distinguish them?
Anything more on this topic?
Daniel, that was an excellent summary, is that both of these changes to the zoning ordinance are ways that the board and staff are trying to make the county more livable and accommodate the residents who are already here. And for example, with the non-conforming housing, I did mention this at the ZOCO meeting, but I really want to underscore it. Other jurisdictions are trying to get rid of non-conforming housing, and our county is trying to find a way to keep it, even when it doesn't quite fit in. And it's really the same thing with this pool. They're trying to find a way to accommodate some of these uses or changes that are in high demand. And I think that's helpful for us when we try to think about how to go forward. We certainly need to be thinking about any negative repercussions, but these are very proactive changes.
Great, thank you for that.
What I think really what we're seeing here for all of these is the transition of this county from suburban to urban. And our zoning ordinance was written when we were suburban, and it was done for that purpose. We have now flipped over that we are increasingly urban, and we're trying to play catch-up and rechange our zoning ordinance to reflect the reality of what the county is now. And it's not easy.
Yes, it is. I think it's the major point of people feel dislocated. And I think one of the roles we play is to almost a therapeutic one in ways. And that's why our SPRCs work. That's why our planning processes work, because people come with ideas that they are comfortable with, that they've worked through, but they must make those ideas accessible to other people with whom they live. And in that cauldron or crucible, we come up with a new synthesis. I mean, it can be very painful, but I guess we all like the work because we're all still here. PFRC.
Thank you, Madam Chair. So next week, on Tuesday, we're going to be kicking off the Ed Center, PFRC, and BLPC.
Wow.
It's going to be a relatively quick process as these things go. We're intending to try to finish up with most of the consideration this calendar year, and then it's going to go to the school board for action on schematic in the January timeframe is at least what we're thinking now. So yeah, that's what we have on our plate.
Wow, great. And form-based code.
Thank you, Commissioner Siegel. If Commissioner McSweeney was here, I would ask her to speak, but the staff resources, as you all know, for the first part of this year has been really dedicated to the Career Center Working Group, and that draft report is now out. I'd also like to go over like the rainbow of development that we have currently along the pipe. Columbia Hills is about to open later this year, which is on the west end of the pike. There is currently a condo building that is recently built and for sale at the WNOD with units beginning at 250 for new build single one-bedroom condos. The Presbyterian Church has demoed or I skipped one. The corner, I'll call it the Food Star site because I don't want to go with whatever the branding is yet. I don't know what it truly is. Has a giant pit has now begun to be filled in. The Presbyterian Church is quickly coming to a skinning of the building. And if you do get to the back of the Wellington and you sneak back there, the Trove along Army-Navy Country Club back there is quickly coming up. So while we don't have any active proposals at the moment, the construction cranes are certainly rolling.
Great, thank you very much. I see that there's a little line here for Chairman's report, and I just want to, there's a little thought that's been sort of percolating in my mind. I do want to share it with you, information that came from Mr. Duffy. We have not seen a lot of SPRCs, a fair amount, but not a lot. In past years, we've really been snowed under with SPRCs. There are, but that does not mean we won't be seeing some. Likely, lots of them for next year. I don't have any further information about that, but I just thought I'd share that with you. So I think that's enough. It's 10:10, and we are adjourned for the month.